August 1st, 1990 was an unassuming day. Ghost, starring Patrick Swayze, was the top film in the US box office, while Mariah Carey's Vision of Love is at the top of the Billboard 100. The Dow Jones was down 6 points from the previous day, and the White House was in a battle over the budget with a democratically controlled Congress. And President George Bush would spend most of the day on vacation with his family in Maine. I personally was under a month old at the time, and presuming my parents read the Modesto Bee that morning, it was a story about local water issues. Half a world away, it was already August 2nd, and at 2 a.m., Iraqi forces began to mobilize. Back in D.C., the president was in the White House infirmary getting treated for overworking his shoulders from golfing. All day, the state and defense departments had been getting alerts about Iraqi troops moving toward the Kuwaiti border. When the National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, found the president around 8 p.m., he advised him to call directly, but a messenger came into the room, telling them that Iraqi troops had already crossed the border. The Gulf War was similar to 9/11 in that the vast majority of people didn't see it coming. And that's not just referring to normal people living their everyday lives outside the Washington Beltway. Even Middle Eastern leaders who had been in talks with Saddam for months were caught off guard. So why did Saddam invade Kuwait? Why did the rest of the world care? And how did the rest of the world miss the signs? When it comes to the causes of the war, there are two sets. There are the long-standing causes that predate Saddam's regime, and then the more recent causes. In the late 1930s, King Ghazi made the first territorial claim on Kuwait, which was a British protectorate at the time. He claimed that Kuwait had been an administrative subdivision of the Basra province of the Ottoman Empire, but that it was forcibly separated from it by the British. The reality is that Kuwait had been an independent sheikdom, which the Ottoman Empire claimed as its sovereign territory, similar to how the Ottomans claimed sovereignty over most Muslim lands under its self-anointed claim to be the true caliphate. In the 1890s, the Sheikh of Kuwait signed a treaty with the British, giving them the right to station troops and base their ships in their territory in exchange for protecting them from the Turks. Iraq's monarchy would be overthrown in 1958, and when the British granted Kuwait independence 3 years later, President Abdul Karim Qasim renewed the territorial claim and even named an Iraqi governor for Kuwait. But the British would keep their forces there for a few extra years, with Iraq finally recognizing Kuwait's independence in 1963 when it was admitted to the United Nations and the Arab League. The Baathists took over Iraq in a coup in 1968, and over the course of the next decade, Saddam Hussein gradually accumulated power and eliminated rivals until he claimed the title of president for himself in 1979. He was functionally in charge prior to this, but in the first half of 1979, his cousin and predecessor, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, was working on a deal with Hafez al-Assad to unify the rival Baath parties and eventually the Iraqi and Syrian states. This new arrangement would have placed al-Bakr at the top of the hierarchy, followed by Assad, with Saddam relegated to third place. With his cousin in ill health, Saddam feared that al-Bakr would either get sidelined quickly by Assad, or that he would die in the near future, leaving Hafez in charge of the new union, thus giving him the power to purge Saddam, as both had purged their respective rivals in the past. So Saddam orchestrated the resignation of al-Bakr, who would die a few years later in obscurity, followed by a massive purge which was filmed and distributed to Baath Party members across Iraq as a warning not to challenge him. We don't need Stalinist methods to deal with traitors here. We need Baathist methods. After the purge, Saddam would reorganize the government in order to preserve his own authority. And just over a year after taking full power, he would take his country to war by invading Iran in September of 1980. The war would last for 8 brutal years, with Iran resorting to using child soldiers, while Iraq would resort to using chemical weapons to make up for the difference in manpower. The Gulf states wouldn't begin lending large amounts of money to Iraq until 1983, when it appeared that Shia Iran might win. The war would cost Saddam about $1 billion a month, and the Gulf states would lend over $130 billion over the course of 6 years. A ceasefire would be reached in 1988, which saw a return to the pre-war borders. Despite Saddam portraying this result as a victory, he had never been in a weaker state politically. Unlike Britain after the Second World War, Iraq was not a cohesive enough society to accept the idea of being victorious and broke, and Saddam trapped himself by claiming victory to a people who wanted its benefits. In addition to the financial problems, additional territorial problems came up from the Iran-Iraq War. Since the 1975 Algiers Agreement, the border between Iran and Iraq had been the center of the Shatt al-Arab River, which leads out to the Gulf, but as you will notice, Iraq doesn't have a lot of Gulf coastline. Additionally, the course of the war resulted in a buildup of silt and a bunch of sunken ships near the entry of the al-Qasr estuary, which made it more difficult for Iraq to export oil by sea. So between Iraq's financial situation and Saddam's own political concerns, it's obvious why he would care, but why would America care so much about Kuwait being invaded? Now, when I asked that question, I'm pretty sure that the first answer that came to a bunch of your minds was oil. And yes, oil obviously is a consideration, but that's not a uniquely American concern. And when it comes to American involvement in the Middle East, oil is actually a pretty low priority, all things considered. As an aside, if you ever need an example of how corporations in general, but oil companies in particular, don't control U.S. foreign policy, just take a look at the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Since 1948, oil companies have been asking the U.S. government to distance itself from Israel. Since most of the oil industry in the Middle East is state-owned, if a foreign company wants access to that oil, they need to placate those governments. And those governments hate two things above all others. They hate the mere existence of Israel, and they hate that the U.S. is so friendly with Israel, which is why non-American oil companies have typically thrived in the region more so than American ones. If the oil companies had had their way, the Wikipedia page for modern Israel would show an end date in 1948, 67, or 73. And since 1945, the top priority of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East wasn't securing access to oil for American or European companies, but denying Soviet influence. The Truman Doctrine saw a global push to contain Soviet influence by providing arms to democratic countries resisting communist aggression. This would be followed up by the Eisenhower Doctrine, in which the U.S. would provide assistance to any country facing threats of armed aggression, in the form of arms sales in the case of Egypt and Israel, and in the form of boots on the ground in the case of Lebanon in 1958, the latter of which was far less common. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. relied on the waning British Empire to exert direct military and political influence. With the independence of Kuwait in 1961, it looked like the British might be pulling out of the region, but President Kennedy would ask Prime Minister Harold Macmillan to keep British troops in the region longer, so the U.S. could focus its forces on other theaters such as Southeast Asia. But as the decade continued, the Kennedy and Johnson administration wanted to pivot toward Arab solutions to solve regional problems. This was because the U.S. military didn't have much of a footprint in the region aside from the occasional naval patrol. The U.S. would lease the use of airfields and ports in former British colonies, but this was mostly used for transporting U.S. troops from Europe to Asia. But in 1964, the Labour Party took power in the UK, and they were less keen on maintaining Britain's overseas positions. This was combined with the ongoing civil wars in North and South Yemen, in which the British were arming monarchist factions against Soviet-backed Republican forces. And then Britain's oil supply was hit with the double whammy of the Six-Day War and the Nigerian Civil War. By the end of 1967, Harold Wilson's government realized the only way they could make the budget work was if they abandoned all of their holdings east of Suez, with the exception of Hong Kong, which they would hold on to until 1997. Since the US and Britain had worked closely on Mideast policy, Wilson would send his Foreign Secretary, George Brown, to meet with US Secretary of State Dean Rusk, to tell the Americans directly, which the Johnson administration didn't take well. For God's sake, be Britain! The Johnson administration would begin looking for a new partner to police the region on its behalf, and it found two candidates, Saudi Arabia and Iran. They would begin selling more weapons and military tools to the regimes, with more confidence placed in the Shah Reza Pahlavi, who was seen as a modernizer, than in King Faisal, who was seen as leading an extravagant absolutist monarchy. Despite this policy beginning under Johnson, it would be dubbed the Nixon Doctrine due to it being fully implemented by his administration.
Let me briefly explain what has been described as the Nixon Doctrine, a policy which not only will help end the war in Vietnam, but which is an essential element of our program to prevent future Vietnams. We Americans are a do-it-yourself people. We're an impatient people. Instead of teaching someone else to do a job, we like to do it ourselves. And this trait has been carried over into our foreign policy. In Korea, and again in Vietnam, the United States furnished most of the money, most of the arms, and most of the men to help the people of those countries defend their freedom against communist aggression. Before any American troops were committed to Vietnam, a leader of another Asian country expressed this opinion to me when I was traveling in Asia as a private citizen. He said, "When you are trying to assist another nation defend its freedom, U.S. policy should be to help them fight the war, but not to fight the war for them." Well, in accordance with this wise counsel, I laid down in Guam 3 principles as guidelines for future American policy toward Asia. First, the United States will keep all of its treaty commitments. Second, we shall provide a shield if a nuclear power threatens the freedom of a nation allied to us or of a nation whose survival we consider vital to our security. Third, in cases involving other types of aggression, we shall furnish military and economic assistance when requested in accordance with our treaty commitments. But we shall look to the nation directly threatened to assume the primary responsibility of providing the manpower for its defense. After I announced this policy, I found that the leaders of the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, South Korea, other nations which might be threatened by communist aggression welcomed this new direction in American foreign policy.
It also happened to dovetail nicely with Vietnamization, which was another effort of offloading the military aspects of U.S. foreign policy onto a regional ally. Both Saudi Arabia and Iran would begin increasing their military budgets, especially in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War's oil embargoes. But of the two, Iran was the more enthusiastic, going so far as to help put down a Soviet-backed uprising in Oman with Iranian commandos in 1973. And despite Nixon's personal unpopularity, the Nixon Doctrine as policy remained popular with his successors, including Jimmy Carter. However, the Iranian Revolution turned a staunch ally with a steady supply of US arms into an enemy that needed to be blunted. The first step was to begin selling more weapons to the Saudis, which was initially approved by the Carter administration and continued by President Reagan. The Saudis needed the friendship, and, if necessary, the help of a great power in defending their oil fields. We wanted to keep the Soviets out of the region as well as prevent the radical anti-American Iran Revolution from spreading to Saudi Arabia, with all the implications that could have for our economy. But the most important thing Carter did for this story was the creation of the Carter Doctrine, which was outlined in his 1980 State of the Union address.
The region, which is now threatened by Soviet troops in Afghanistan, is of great strategic importance. It contains more than 2/3 of the world's exportable oil. The Soviet effort to dominate Afghanistan has brought Soviet military forces to within 300 miles of the Indian Ocean and close to the Straits of Hormuz, a waterway through which most of the world's oil must flow. Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force.
And although Carter didn't aid Saddam directly when Iraq invaded Iran later that year, he did little to inhibit the attack, with the UN Security Council not acting until a month later, and even then simply calling for a ceasefire without a demand for Iraq to withdraw from Iranian territory. Now, there is a pretty widespread myth that the Reagan administration sold weapons to Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, which is not true. Now, that's not to say that they didn't aid Iraq during the war, they certainly did, but this was mostly in the form of intelligence reports. CIA spy satellites took pictures of Iranian troop positions and delivered them to the Iraqis, which Saddam was distrustful of, believing the US was secretly working with the Iranians. But over the course of the decade, the US would try to build closer ties with Iraq. With the fall of the Shah, our first choice as the stabilizing force in the region, the United States turned to a policy of balancing off Iran and Iraq. This led the Reagan administration to tilt toward Baghdad during the Iran-Iraq conflict, not out of preference for one of the two reprehensible regimes, but because we wanted neither to win. The Reagan administration wanted to use Iraq to weaken Iran, who was supporting international terrorism and abetting the hostage crises, as well as using Iraq as a counterbalance against Hafez al-Assad, who had been causing trouble for the US in Lebanon. In addition to geostrategic goals, the US also wanted to use Iraq to clamp down on Palestinian terrorism. Ba'athist Iraq had been a supporter and safe haven for a number of Palestinian terror groups such as Abu Nidal, whose assassination attempt on Shlomo Argov triggered the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Iraq had broken diplomatic ties with the US in 1967 over the Johnson administration's support for Israel. But if the US wanted to give more direct forms of aid to Iraq, the State Department would need to normalize relations, but they couldn't do it so long as Iraq was on the US state sponsor of terror list. In 1983, the US and Iraq exchanged special envoys, with Iraq sending their Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs, Ismat Khatani, and the US sending Donald Rumsfeld. Which is where this picture that so many conspiracists have loved to plaster everywhere came from. Later that year, Secretary of State George Shultz would meet with Iraq's Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz, where he told them that Saddam needed to stop supporting Abu Nidal and other terrorists before the US could reopen its embassy in Baghdad. And surprisingly, Saddam complied, kicking Abu Nidal out of Iraq, leading to the formal reopening of relations in November of 1984. But the relationship was always shaky. When the Iran-Contra scandal was uncovered, this validated every paranoid thought Saddam had. The US was working with the Israelis to sell arms to the Iranians. Now, when you understand the actual history around the scandal, you know that it was not about America aiding Iran against the Iraqis, but that was the functional outcome. And Iraq made it difficult to maintain formal relations when they began using chemical weapons against the Iranian child soldiers and human wave attacks. And it was even harder when they started to deliberately target the Kurds of northern Iraq. Due to most of the Iraqi military being placed on the front with Iran, the Kurds were largely left to their own devices. But in 1987, Saddam would place his cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, in charge of the north, and basically gave him carte blanche to re-establish Baghdad's authority. He was tasked with depopulating a collection of rural areas referred to as prohibited zones, and between April and June of 1987, they bombed them with chemical weapons, and anybody who survived the attacks were abducted from the hospitals and never seen again. This resulted in over 700 villages being razed, and the only reason they didn't finish the job then was a manpower shortage. This campaign, known as Al-Anfal, would resume in February 1988, where the military began nighttime attacks on the headquarters of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan and finished it in September with their attacks on the Kurdish Democratic Party. This is probably one of the most blatant genocides ever recorded, to the point where the Iraqi regime didn't even try to cover it up. And for years after, Iraqi media would celebrate the anniversaries of the attacks. They were so brutal that during the 1988 election, Vice President Bush declared that violators of the chemical weapons treaties should be punished. But it was easy enough to condemn foreign dictators when you didn't have to deal with them yourself. But after he won the November election, George Bush and all the members of his administration would have to confront the political realities they were faced with. The same Reagan administration, famous for steering a straightforward course in its policies toward the Soviet Union, was now notorious for running circles in the Middle East. Security concerns had led it to attack Libya while coddling Iraq, and to arm both Saddam and the leaders of the Iranian Revolution. It provisioned the Arab freedom fighters in Afghanistan and suckered the Saudi theocracy while ignoring the threats posed by both. At first backed, then protested Israel's invasion of Lebanon, expedited then delayed weapons shipments to the Jewish state, helped evacuate the PLO from Beirut only to boycott the organization thereafter, and then, in a final volte-face, engaged in a diplomatic dialogue with Arafat.
With the failures of the Lebanon intervention and the Reagan plan, Secretary of State George Shultz scaled back U.S. diplomacy in the region. We would not send troops into Middle East trouble spots or outline comprehensive plans for resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict. Rather, we would focus on getting peace talks started. Or if the Arabs and Israelis could not even talk, the conflict would never end. Instead, it would threaten both to escalate dangerously and to disrupt the world oil market and the U.S. economy.
From day one, the last thing I wanted to do was touch the Middle East peace process. With what appeared to be fundamental and historic changes possible, I frankly saw the Arab-Israeli dispute as a pitfall to be avoided rather than an opportunity to be exploited. I was determined to resist the siren song of Israel and its Arab neighbors, particularly when it seemed that neither side was interested in considering the difficult choices necessary to create a real peace process. After everything they went through with Iraq and the Middle East over the prior decade, they still believed that Saddam could be reined in by the moderate voices of his neighbors, Hosni Mubarak and King Hussein. They even believed this tamed Saddam could play a role in moderating the Palestinians, which they hoped would finally bring an end to the ever-evasive peace process. When entering office, the Bush administration spent the first year re-evaluating their foreign policy priorities, and on October 2, 1989, the president signed National Security Directive 26, which formalized many of the informal policies the Reagan administration had toward Iraq. This decision was based on a presumption that Iraq was too economically fragile to engage in another war after peace was made a year prior. In a September meeting, President Bush is said to have asked CIA Director Richard Kerr whether he thought the war had moderated Saddam, to which Kerr is reported to have said,
The leopard does not change his spots.
Toward the end of the war with Iran, the U.S. began giving Iraq access to funds via the Commodity Credit Corporation. Originally, it was used to subsidize farmers during the Great Depression by buying out surplus crops and animal products. The Reagan administration would use it to help feed Iraqis by giving the Iraqi government credits to buy American agricultural goods. Originally, it was $500 million annually, but the Bush administration would up this to $1 billion, which was popular with congressmen from farming districts. On top of this, Saddam's government had a pretty good track record of repaying the loans, so there weren't many red flags being raised. And in addition to relying on Saddam's Arab neighbors, the Bush administration was also hoping to change Iraq's behavior and moderate Saddam by getting the country dependent upon U.S. largesse. And Directive 26 should not be understood as a blank check to Iraq either. The Iraqi leadership must understand that any illegal use of chemical and/or biological weapons will lead to economic and political sanctions, for which we would seek the broadest possible support from our allies and friends. For his part, Saddam definitely tried to look like he was engaging in political liberalization. He began his own version of perestroika that allowed the press to publicly criticize the government ministers and technocrats, as well as allowing non-Ba'ath Party members to run for public offices. However, Saddam and his family were off limits from public criticism, as well as criticism against security policy, and non-Ba'ath politicians had to be approved by the security services and could only run for office as independents. In addition to these, Saddam also began buying loyalty from foreign Arab media and leaders through expensive gifts. Saddam had a penchant for gifting fleets of Mercedes-Benz and Rolls-Royces. In addition to the political reforms, Saddam would try to attract foreign investment through some economic liberalization, which was about as authentic as Russia's economic liberalization, which is to say, not authentic at all. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out this previous video. Iraq had a large number of state-owned industries that it would privatize into the hands of Saddam's family and inner circle. They also privatized public works projects in the exact same way, and when they all failed to revive the economy, Saddam blamed corrupt ministers and bureaucrats, using it as an excuse to engage in another purge of the regime. And for a short time, much of the world bought into these Potemkin reforms. In 1989, the Arab world was still reeling from the war, and most were more afraid of the ceasefire breaking down than of Iraq attacking a fellow Arab country. Hosni Mubarak and King Hussein genuinely believed that they could moderate Saddam, and in February 1989, they created a new international body, the Arab Cooperation Council, which was intended to be a body of pro-American Arab states that could form a voting bloc in the Arab League, and eventually become a Middle Eastern equivalent of the European Economic Community. But it wouldn't take long for Iraq to begin undermining these assessments, because on October 6, 1989, Secretary of State James Baker met with Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz, whom Baker would later describe as a later-day von Ribbentrop. At this meeting, Baker was trying to get Saddam to help with the Arab-Israeli peace process, but Aziz wanted to complain about an alleged conspiracy to undermine Saddam's rule. The truth is that the US, UK, and Israel were all independently trying to prevent Saddam from procuring weapons of mass destruction, which was a publicly known policy priority for all three countries. But Saddam interpreted the actual enforcement of the policy as the US trying to destabilize his regime, and in 1990 he would begin to bite the hands that fed him. The war had wrecked the Iraqi economy, which placed Iraq tens of billions of dollars into debt, with the cost of reconstruction estimated at $230 billion. While most of the state's revenue came from its $13 billion in annual oil sales. It would take 21 years of oil revenue just to make up for the cost of the war and reconstruction at that point, not including the cost of actually running the government for those next 21 years. And so, given Iraq's massive debt woes, Saddam would begin a campaign to alleviate them. On February 12, 1990, Saddam held a rare meeting with U.S. officials below the rank of cabinet secretary. Speaking with Undersecretary John Kelly and Ambassador April Glaspie, Saddam complained that there were too many U.S. ships in the Persian Gulf and claimed this was part of an American conspiracy. What do I see when I look south? Lots of ships. Lots of ships, yes. They're warships, naval ships. Whose ships are they? I believe they're American warships. Why would there be so many warships in the Gulf when there is no war? Could it be that they are aiming at me? Kelly told Saddam that the U.S. has had ships stationed in the Gulf since 1948, and that the number currently there was actually lower than the historical average, and that they would continue to patrol the region for the foreseeable future. But Saddam dismissed this, saying they were not needed. the US government felt that Saddam was being ungrateful towards the US, especially for the US removing Iraq from the state sponsor of terror list, which not only let the US give them more aid and open more trade, but encouraged the rest of the world to trade more with Iraq. And this was in addition to the US overlooking Saddam's use of chemical weapons during and after the war. But Saddam would also become increasingly hostile towards his Arab neighbors. 2 weeks later, Saddam attended a meeting of the Arab Cooperation Council in Amman, Jordan. At this meeting, Saddam began to speak of a conspiracy of the US, UK, and Israel to control the world's supply and price of oil, and that the Arab world should pull its investments out of the West and put their money into the USSR. The country will have the greatest influence in the region through the Gulf and its oil, will maintain its superiority as a superpower without equal to compete with it. This means that if the Gulf people, along with all Arabs, are not careful, the Arab Gulf region will be governed by the wishes of the United States. Prices would be fixed in line with a special perspective benefiting American interests and ignoring the interests of others. Saddam suggested that they should all be more belligerent toward the US, claiming the Americans didn't have the will or conviction to sustain casualties, citing their withdrawal from Lebanon in 1984. He also began demanding that the Gulf states need to extend more loans to Iraq and forgive those given during the war. Let the Gulf state know that if they do not give this money to me, I know how to get it. Iraq would attract negative attention in the international press in March of 1990, when they executed a foreign journalist. Farzad Bazoft, a British journalist of Iranian heritage, was invited to northern Iraq to cover the elections happening in Kurdistan. But while in Iraq, he went to investigate an explosion at a munitions dump, where he tried to get a soil sample to test to see if there had been chemical weapons. Bazoft was arrested by Iraqi authorities and forced to confess that he was an Israeli spy, for which they executed him by firing squad on March 15th, after which his body was dropped off at the British embassy in Baghdad, which sparked international outrage, and it would especially anger the British public, with Margaret Thatcher publicly condemning Saddam and his regime. Iraq was a country which had used chemical weapons, not just in war but against its own people. Saddam Hussein was not only an international brigand, he was also a loser who had done immense damage both to the Palestinian cause and to the Arabs, and who over 8 years had vainly thrown wave after wave of young Iraqis into war against Iran. But it wouldn't just spark outrage in Britain, but amongst journalists in general. Whether it was because Bazoft's position as a journalist meant his case attracted more attention than Saddam's myriad other victims, or because his execution occurred at a time when international concern was already being expressed about Iraq's human rights abuses and development of weapons of mass destruction, Bazoft's judicial murder proved to be a watershed in the West's relations with Baghdad. Tensions continue to escalate in early April when Saddam Hussein gives a speech to members of the Iraqi military where he admits that Iraq still has chemical weapons and that they were willing to use them and make fire eat up half of Israel. This was especially concerning to Israel, who had spent the last few years doing everything it could to prevent Saddam from acquiring the means to build chemical weapons, going as far as to assassinate a foreign scientist helping the Iraqi regime build a supergun to fire chemical weapons at Israel. Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Arens was especially angry due to Hosni Mubarak having recently told him Saddam wouldn't dare use WMDs on Israel for fear of retaliation via nuclear weapons. Concerned about this heightened rhetoric, Ambassador Glaspie sent a message from Brent Scowcroft to Saddam to warn him about escalating regional tensions, all the while trying to maintain warm relations. As concerned as we are about Iraq's chemical, nuclear, and missile programs, we are not in any sense preparing the way for a preemptive military unilateral effort to eliminate these programs. 2 weeks later, a delegation from the U.S. Senate visited the Middle East, and at the request of Secretary Baker, visited Baghdad to meet with Saddam in order to reinforce the administration's message that they were not involved in the Israeli operations, and that the words of the U.S. media were not representative of the White House's views. Daily the Arabs hear scorn directed at them from the West. Daily they bear insults. Why? Has the Zionist mentality taken control of you to the point that it has deprived you of your humanity?
There are fundamental differences between our countries. We have free media in the U.S. When you say Western, Mr. President, I don't know what you mean when you say the West. I don't know whether or not you mean the government. Please allow me to say that only 12 hours earlier, President Bush had assured me that he wants better relations and that the U.S. government wants better relations with Iraq. We believe that the Congress also does not represent Bush or the government.
I believe your problem is with the Western media, not with the U.S. government. The press is spoiled and conceited. All the journalists consider themselves brilliant political scientists. They do not want to see anything succeeding or achieving its objectives. My advice is that you allow those bastards to come here and see things for themselves. Journalists are like a spoiled child. If this child is given a sweet in response to his desires and cries, he will continue to cry and demand more. The Senate delegation would report to the White House that they believed Saddam was someone they could deal with, despite other issues, and would oppose the sanctions the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was proposing at the time, feeling they would further exacerbate Saddam's paranoia. However, the delegation wrote off some statements from Saddam just as par for the course Arab rhetoric, which in hindsight turned out to be far more than just shibboleths and virtue signals. The right of the Arabs to possess any weapon their enemy possesses. Iraq does not possess atomic bombs. If we did, we would announce that, to preserve peace and to prevent Israel from using their atomic bombs. And U.S. intelligence would continue to write off Saddam's increasingly hostile language, such as an interview with Yasser Arafat shortly after his meeting with the Senate delegation. We will fight America, and with God's help, we will defeat it and kick it out of the whole region. If America strikes us, we will hit back. Maybe we cannot reach Washington, but we can send someone who has an expensive belt. In May, Saddam called an emergency summit of the Arab League in Baghdad. The public purpose of this conference was to discuss the impact the collapse of the Soviet Union would have on the region, as well as to issue a joint condemnation of the migration of Soviet Jews to Israel. Now, this was also intertwined with the recent killing of 7 Palestinian workers at a bus stop near Tel Aviv, which was followed up by the U.S. vetoing a UN Security Council resolution to have UN observers sent to the West Bank and Gaza. But after the public proceedings came the private meetings, where the Arab states would hash out their inter-Arab conflicts. Saddam used this summit to complain about how low oil prices were, and blamed an as-of-yet unnamed set of Arab Gulf states for overproducing. Of course, most of them knew he was referring to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait, whom Saddam had been inserting into his conspiracy theories about the US, UK, and Israel in private discussions. But as he had for months, Saddam escalated his rhetoric and compared the OPEC violations to acts of war against Iraq, and demanded that Kuwait forgive the debt owed by Iraq, cut its oil production, and have additional loans extended to Iraq. Now, none of the Gulf states expected Iraq to actually pay back the loan, so they were functionally forgiven. But the smaller states, such as Kuwait and the UAE, wanted to keep the debts on their ledgers in order to maintain some kind of leverage over Iraq in international negotiations, and thus refused to forgive the debts. Although not naming names, Saddam began to issue threats at the summit. You know, brothers, some of our Arab brothers flooded the world market with more oil than it needed. War is fought with soldiers and much harm is done by explosions, but it is also done by economic means. We have reached a point where we can no longer withstand pressure. Back in Washington, debate with the Bush administration began to percolate over whether to start pressuring Saddam to cool the rhetoric. The National Security Council opposed suspending credit or enacting sanctions on Iraq, fearing it would exacerbate Saddam's paranoia. But the State Department was becoming more skeptical of the policy toward Iraq.
Our policy is based on an illusion that we can moderate this guy.
Concerned with Saddam's increasing belligerence toward the U.S. and its neighbors, Secretary Baker has Ambassador Glaspie send another message to Saddam. Iraq will be on a collision course with the U.S. if it continues to engage in actions that threaten the stability of the region, undermine global arms effort, and flout U.S. laws. By early June, Saddam had begun planning for an invasion of Kuwait. He met with leaders of the Republican Guard and ordered Lieutenant General Ayad al-Rawi to draft detailed plans of attack, and began air surveillance of Kuwait, and then delivered the orders to ground commanders. By early July, Baghdad had decided that annexation would be the ultimate goal of the invasion, which would be referred to as Project 17. It wasn't until July 15th when Iraq explicitly named Kuwait and the UAE as the culprits for keeping oil prices down. In a formal memo to the Arab League, Tariq Aziz demanded that Kuwait forgive Iraq's debts, and accused them of slant drilling, extracting an additional $2.4 billion worth of oil from the shared Rumaila oil field, and demanded that they pay an indemnity to Iraq of at least that much. He then accuses Kuwait of conspiring with non-Arab powers to economically cripple Iraq over its increasing support for the Palestinians. Additionally, he then demanded that the Gulf states all donate money to an Arab Marshall Plan to rebuild Iraq. What should be noted is that nowhere in this memo does Aziz mention Iraq's territorial claims on Kuwait. Despite increasing debate within the administration over its Iraq policy, the president's time had mostly been occupied with the deterioration of the Soviet Union, as well as the debate with Congress over the budget. Additionally, Hosni Mubarak and the Saudi ambassador Prince Bandar had asked the Bush administration not to provoke Saddam and allow them time to find an Arab solution to the crisis. OPEC negotiations were held in Geneva, where Iraq got an agreement with the Kuwaitis, Emiratis, and Saudis to raise oil prices, and for a renewed commitment by OPEC to enforce quotas. In addition, Kuwait and the UAE agreed to opening up bilateral talks with Iraq. Since the CIA hadn't detected any significant troop movements in Iraq, they didn't see the need to push for more aggressive actions, but this would quickly change. They detected the first troop movements on July 17th, with the Hammurabi Division of the Republican Guard deployed to the Kuwaiti border. The State Department responded with a statement saying the U.S. would ensure the continued flow of oil and would support the collective self-defense of the Gulf states. On July 19th, the State Department would also issue new guidelines to embassies in the region, which called on all of them to relay that the U.S. supported the resolution of all disputes peacefully, but that the U.S. would take no position on the bilateral concerns of Iraq and Kuwait, while remaining committed to improving relations with Iraq. But on July 21st, Saddam ordered another 30,000 troops to the border, claiming it was just a military exercise. On July 20th, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney met with the Israeli Defense Minister and Chief of Staff Moshe Arens and Ehud Barak. The Israelis presented evidence that Iraq was dangerously close to possessing a functional nuclear weapon, which was further along than U.S. intelligence had estimated. They then asked the U.S. for assistance with their anti-missile systems. Arens was also concerned about the growing closeness between Iraq and Jordan, fearing Saddam might post ground forces in Jordan, which he warned might require a preemptive attack on Israel's part. On July 21st, the UAE requested the U.S. participate in a joint military exercise, hoping to deter Iraqi aggression. The Saudis initially opposed the idea, but the British administration would approve the action, sending tanker planes for aerial refueling. The UAE then requested direct military aid, which the State Department initially refused, but after lobbying from General Norman Schwarzkopf of Central Command, the Defense Department agreed, with State reversing course a few days later. Major General al-Sani of Kuwait initially put the kingdom's forces on high alert, but the emir ordered them to stand down, believing that Saddam was just saber-rattling, and there were historical precedents to back up this belief. Back in 1973, Iraqi troops had crossed the border into Kuwait and temporarily occupied an abandoned military base, and then withdrew a couple weeks later. Additionally, Iraq had signed a non-aggression pact with Saudi Arabia in 1989, making it seem like Iraq wasn't interested in conflicts with its Arab neighbors. However, an NSC meeting was presented with evidence that the number of Iraqi troops gathering around Basra would reach 100,000 by July 24th, at which point Chairman Powell asked General Schwarzkopf to begin drafting measures to respond to a minor border incursion. The Pentagon didn't officially announce the arrival of its aerial tankers to the Gulf, but it would have Ambassador Glaspie deliver a secret alert to Saddam in order to avoid an accidental confrontation. This joint exercise with the UAE seemed to genuinely concern Saddam. On July 25th, Saddam would meet with Ambassador Glaspie under very unusual circumstances. She was taken to one of dozens of identical palaces Saddam had built around Iraq, and they'd driven her in a blacked-out vehicle for hours so that she couldn't tell where they actually were. When she finally met Saddam, he gave one of his trademark lectures on U.S.-Iraq relations, blaming the U.S. for numerous issues in Iraq and espousing various conspiracy theories about Zionists manipulating world events, which most Western diplomats had learned to tune out. I do not belittle you, but I hold this view by taking the geography and nature of American society into account. Yours is a society which cannot accept 10,000 dead in one battle. Once Saddam was finished, Glaspie reiterated U.S. policy as all embassy staff had been instructed to do back on the 19th, emphasizing that the U.S. would support its friends' self-defense, ensure the continued flow of oil from the Gulf, and encourage the resolution of all conflicts peacefully, but that the U.S. didn't take a position on the validity of border disputes between Arab states. At this meeting, Saddam would assure Glaspie that he had no intention of invading Kuwait, and that he was confident a negotiated settlement would be reached soon. After the meeting, Glaspie communicated her belief that Saddam was about to de-escalate. With UAE maneuvers, we have finally caught his attention, and that is good. I believe we would be well advised to ease off on public criticism of Iraq until we see how negotiations develop. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, many in the media criticized Glaspie for not being more assertive with Saddam and explicitly demand that he not invade Kuwait and that she threatened U.S. retaliation if they did. But most ambassadors, not just in the US but around the world, have actually defended her decision. She followed the instructions that her superior, the Secretary of State, had given to all ambassadors in the region. And given the situation that she was in, taken to an unknown location with no way of receiving additional instructions from Washington, she did exactly as she should have done. She followed, executive policy to the letter. There are those who disagree somewhat. In his 1995 memoir, James Baker would say that he believed that Glaspie's words were an unintentional signal to Saddam that the U.S. would not respond very strongly to an invasion of Kuwait. However, this perception is challenged by Saddam's foreign minister, Tariq Aziz, who in a 1996 interview on Frontline said her words were not interpreted as a green light. Part of the debate was fostered by the transcript of the conversation. The Iraqi government released their version first, and their version made it look like that the U.S., through Glaspie's words, was not really concerned about what Saddam was doing in the Gulf. This would require the State Department to produce its own version of the transcript, taken by Glaspie's interpreter, which included this line excluded from the Iraqi version. Is it not reasonable for us to be concerned when the President and the Foreign Minister both publicly say that Kuwaiti actions are the equivalent of military aggression? And then we learn that many units of the Republican Guard have been sent to the border. Is it not reasonable for us to ask, in the spirit of friendship, not confrontation, what are your intentions? And her report to the White House was in line with what most experts, including other Arab leaders, were saying and thinking at the time. Saddam was an egotistical strongman, prone to flights of fancy and exaggeration, in a part of the world where saber-rattling was just a normal part of diplomacy. And despite all the saber-rattling, the border between the two countries was still open, with people and business going back and forth across the border, which is not usually what you see when a pair of countries are on the verge of war.
The Iraqis camped right on the main road from Basra to Kuwait in plain sight. The road was still open to general traffic, and our military attachés from Baghdad to Kuwait were driving up and down the road, counting the troops as they drove along, confirming all that we could see from our satellites.
David Cole, in his recent book, The Achilles Trap, summarizes the root cause of this crisis succinctly. The problem was not that Glaspie failed to warn Saddam when she had the chance. It was that the Bush administration failed to recognize what Saddam had decided upon until it was too late. Despite Arab leaders insisting that there was no concern for violence between Iraq and Kuwait, the CIA detected more troops massing on the border, along with the appearance of 300 new diplomats of suspiciously bulky build at the Iraqi embassy in Kuwait City. But when the administration learned that Saddam had agreed to go to the negotiating table with the Kuwaitis and Emiratis, President Bush decided to send a letter to Baghdad. I was pleased to learn of the agreement between Iraq and Kuwait to begin negotiations in Jeddah to find a peaceful solution to the current tensions between you. The United States and Iraq both have a strong interest in preserving the peace and stability of the Middle East. For this reason, we believe these difficulties are best resolved by peaceful means and not by threats involving military force or conflict. The Iraqi and Kuwaiti diplomats met in Saudi Arabia on July 31st. But the talks quickly broke down. Despite this, the Saudis continued the talks over the phone, serving as the middleman between Saddam and Emir Jabbar. Back in 1989, the Saudis had already agreed to forgive most of Iraq's debts, hence why Saddam was less antagonistic towards Saudi Arabia. King Fahd would try to convince the Emir to forgive the debts as well, and after hours of discussions, Javier agreed. King Fahd would call Saddam late at night on July 31st to tell him, "I have incredible news for you. The Emir has agreed to your terms," telling King Fahd that it was too little, too late. On August 1st, General Schwarzkopf met with Colin Powell and Dick Cheney at the Pentagon to brief them on the ground situation in the Gulf. The CIA was now warning of an imminent attack, but all the parties presented believed it would be a limited attack, mostly occupying disputed oil fields and the Gulf Islands. at which point Scowcroft suggested that the president should call Saddam personally to dissuade him from attacking. Schwarzkopf gave the NSC a list of potential options based on what assets the U.S. already had in the region. They debated the possibility of deploying additional Marine squadrons from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, along with the USS Independence, which was already en route. But realizing this wouldn't have the desired effects unless Saddam knew they were coming from a public announcement, which couldn't be made without the president's approval. By the end of the meeting, they had begun receiving reports about Iraqi troop movements. Diplomats from the embassy were relaying the developing situation in Kuwait City. The war had already begun. With the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to argue that we should have recognized earlier that we weren't going to moderate Saddam's behavior and shifted our policy approach sooner, and to a greater degree than we did. And while I wish we'd focused more attention on Iraq earlier, given what happened, I remain unpersuaded that anything we might have done, short of actually moving armed forces into the region, would have deterred Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Our approach to averting conflict, to warn against belligerent behavior, to make clear we would stand by our friends, yet continue to offer good relations for good behavior, had failed. Would a deterrent policy such as threatening to counter any Iraqi use of force have been more effective? Since Saddam later was not dissuaded from his course by pressure of 500,000 troops arrayed directly against him, it is not likely. Not all wars are avoidable. Saddam believed he was too important to U.S. foreign policy to be removed from power, and his conspiratorial mindset led him to believe that the U.S. was well aware of his ambitions, hence their lack of more forceful action. The main problem was that the Bush administration remained committed to improving relations with Baghdad, hoping against hope. In pursuit of this policy, President Reagan and Bush pulled their punches when Saddam gassed his enemies. Saddam saw what he could get away with, and this surely influenced his calculations about Kuwait. Saddam tended to think that the CIA was omniscient, that it knew Iraq's important secrets. Surely, therefore, the U.S. knew about his clandestine plan to occupy Kuwait. The administration only realized this the morning of August 1st, when CIA satellites picked up large movements of troops, and even then they didn't think Saddam would take all of Kuwait. An upstart dictator with delusions of grandeur was the last thing President Bush wanted to deal with. The Berlin Wall had just fallen 9 months earlier. Eastern Europe was in the throes of revolution, all the while the administration was trying to get the START Treaty signed and ratified in both the USSR and the Senate. And that's not including all the domestic issues he has to deal with. Despite all of this, he still needed to do something. If you want the full context, then make sure you watch this previous video. But in this video, we're going to look at how the world responded to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The U.S. National Security Council met at 11 p.m. D.C. time on August 1st, and didn't adjourn until 2 a.m. the next day. They debated what short notice options they had, such as freezing both Iraqi and Kuwaiti assets, which the UK would also do shortly after. Although most of the attendees were open to doing something, some weren't entirely convinced Iraq annexing a small neighboring country was detrimental to U.S. interests. Colin Powell, always more politically minded, brought up concerns about polling numbers and public support, linking the concerns to his experience in the Vietnam War. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney was mostly concerned about the invasion's impact on the global economy, with Saddam controlling nearly 50% of the world's known oil reserves. But just as the NSC was adjourning, the United Nations Security Council met in New York. At the time, Secretary of State James Baker was meeting with Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze in Siberia, so the ambassador to the UN, Thomas Pickering, was charged with getting a resolution passed. They would draft a clear and concise resolution condemning the invasion. The Security Council, alarmed by the invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990 by the military forces of Iraq, determining that there exists a breach of international peace and security as regards the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, acting under Articles 39 and 40 of the Charter of the United Nations, 1. Condemns the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, 2. Demands that Iraq withdraw immediately and unconditionally all its forces to the positions in which they were located on August 1, 1990, 3. Calls upon Iraq and Kuwait to begin immediately intensive negotiations for the resolution of their differences and supports all efforts in this regard, and especially those of the League of Arab States, 4. Decides to meet again as necessary to consider further steps to ensure compliance with the present resolution. 14 of the 15 members of the Security Council voted in favor of this measure, with the representative of Yemen neither voting nor abstaining. The UN's General Secretary, Javier Perez de Cuellar, would go on to, if not blame the US and Soviet Union for the attack, then to at least blame them for preventing earlier UN intervention. I could have gone to the Security Council. The Council would likely have issued a warning statement and possibly sent a fact-finding mission to the area. I believe this would have had a restraining influence on Saddam Hussein. He claims that the US and USSR not sharing intelligence gathered by their satellites with the Security Council prevented the UN from sending a fact-finding mission to Iraq, which he thinks would have delayed or prevented the invasion. However, this assertion is based on a conversation he had days before Desert Storm began, where Saddam complained that the sanctions and military force were approved of before the UN even had the facts. Of course, this was most likely just Saddam passing the blame for the invasion to someone else, and it's in the General Secretary's interest to assert that their role is more important than it actually is. Regardless, they had an invasion to deal with. About 100,000 Iraqi troops had crossed the border, along with 300 tanks. Saddam had also sent in helicopters to deploy special forces, but they were ill-equipped, without night vision, and had little experience flying at night. In order to avoid getting lost and evade anti-aircraft radars, they flew close to the ground, which caused sand to be blown into the air, obscuring the pilots' visions, resulting in numerous helicopters crashing into each other, as well as accidentally hitting power lines along the Baghdad-Kuwait highway, knocking out electricity in parts of the country. By 9 a.m. Baghdad time, the Iraqis had destroyed Kuwaiti command centers and defeated Kuwait's 16,000-strong army with little resistance. Most of the Kuwaiti Air Force, along with the government and about 300,000 citizens, had fled the country, with only the emir's brother remaining behind, who would be killed by Saddam's Republican Guard on the steps of the palace. When asked to justify the invasion later that day, Saddam claimed that they had intervened in support of an anti-monarchist coup that allegedly happened the night before. The Iraqi Baathists had a history of portraying all of their acts as continuations of the 1958 coup that deposed the pro-British Hashemite dynasty, like they had done with their own coup in 1968. They set up a puppet regime called the Provisional Revolutionary Government, and implied that they were going to withdraw within a few days once they put down the monarchist insurgents. But nobody believed these promises, with the US reporting that Iraqi forces were digging in and fortifying their positions near the border with Saudi Arabia. Western analysts feared the impacts of a long occupation by Iraqi forces. The longer they stayed, the more difficult it would be to drive them out. Needless to say, most world leaders did not believe Saddam or his government. The NSC met again at 8 a.m., with General Norman Schwarzkopf of Central Command explaining the current state on the ground, as well as potential forms of retaliation with the resources they had in the region, which were scant. Secretary Cheney discussed the potential economic impacts again, and from the beginning was advocating a military solution to the crisis. The National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, pushed for an economic embargo of Iraq, cutting off the flow of oil from Iraq and Kuwait, while asking the rest of OPEC to increase oil production to make up for the decline in supply. President Bush would order Tom Pickering to get a Security Council resolution on it passed, while also asking Congress to pass a unilateral embargo. When the president asked about other military options, Schwarzkopf and Colin Powell told him that they would need significantly more forces in the region to do anything more than limited airstrikes. However, Powell advised President Bush to establish a red line at the Saudi border, which the president agreed to. This fits within everyone's presumptions. Defending Saudi Arabia was within U.S. interests, but nobody there believed the president would be willing to send American soldiers to die for Kuwait. Although the invasion of Kuwait was barely 14 hours old, it was clear that President Bush had already determined that Saddam's aggression had to be checked. He instructed us to be prepared to fight if Iraq took the American embassy staff hostage. The State Department would consider sending an evacuation order to all American citizens in Iraq and Kuwait, along with formally cutting off diplomatic ties. The president would order an aircraft carrier from the Indian Ocean Fleet to the Gulf, while the Defense and State Departments began seeking permission from the Saudis to deploy a squadron of F-15s to deter further aggression from Saddam. Cheney and Powell would meet with the Saudi ambassador, Prince Bandar, telling him that the U.S. was prepared to send 200,000 soldiers to Saudi Arabia. Despite all of these developments, the Arab states were telling Bush to use restraint, hoping to reach an Arab solution to the crisis. The truth is, at the moment I had no idea what our options were. I did know for sure that the aggression had to be stopped, and Kuwait sovereignty restored. After the NSC meeting, Bush boarded a flight for a pre-planned trip to Colorado to meet with Margaret Thatcher, both of whom were scheduled to give speeches at the Aspen Institute Symposium. The president gave a speech based on plans drafted by Colin Powell, which in his words would mark the end of the Cold War strategy of containment, calling for a reduction in enlistments by 500,000. Thatcher had arrived in Aspen the day before, while Iraqi troops were building up on the border, and the next morning she approved the deployment of the HMS York, Penang, and Mombasa to the Gulf. Despite these speeches being in the works for months, they would be overshadowed by the ongoing crisis in Kuwait. Bush and Thatcher met after the symposium, with the invasion the primary topic of discussion, sharing the intelligence each had access to. Thatcher was adamantly opposed to appeasing Saddam, calling on both her personal experience in dealing with Argentina in 1982, as well as alluding to Neville Chamberlain's policies toward Hitler. With the UK more dependent on the Middle East for oil, she feared giving Saddam control of 2/3 of the world's known reserves. President Bush was more reluctant to use force, with the ghosts of Vietnam still lingering in the background, which Thatcher feared might lead him to appeasing Saddam with Saudi territory. Although I am a strong believer in international law, I did not like unnecessary resort to the UN, because it suggested that sovereign states lacked the moral authority to act on their own behalf. If it became accepted that force could not be used, even in self-defense, when the United Nations approved, neither Britain's interests nor those of international justice and order would be served. If Iraq wins, no small state is safe. This is no time to go wobbly, George. Although most of the Arab states were nominally opposed to the invasion, some would try to play the mediator between Saddam and the West, namely King Hussein of Jordan, who had called both Bush and Thatcher, begging them to allow the Arabs to resolve the dispute themselves. Brent Scowcroft was in agreement with Thatcher's concerns of appeasement, and feared leaving the resolution of the crisis to the Arabs would result in further Iraqi belligerence. President Bush was afraid of Israel taking unilateral action against Saddam as they had back in 1981, especially because the Israelis were the only country in the region that believed Saddam's actions were more than just saber-rattling. After their meeting, the two would issue a joint condemnation of the invasion.
Iraq has violated and taken over the territory of a country which is a full member of the United Nations. That is totally unacceptable. And if it were allowed to endure, then there would be many other small countries that could never feel safe. The fundamental question is this: whether the nations of the world have the collective will effectively to see that Security Council resolution is upheld, whether they have the collective will effectively to do anything which the Security Council further agrees to see that Iraq withdraws and that the government of Kuwait is restored to Kuwait. None of us can do it separately. We need a collective and effective will of the nations belonging to the United Nations.
Prime Minister Thatcher and I are looking at it on exactly the same wavelength, concerned about this naked aggression, condemning it, and hoping that a peaceful solution will be found that will result in the restoration of the Kuwaiti leaders to their rightful place, and prior to that, a withdrawal of Iraqi forces.
After the press conference, President Bush would receive a call from King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, who had talked to Saddam earlier that day and couldn't convince him to withdraw. King Fahd informed Bush that most of the Kuwaiti government and royal family were now in Saudi Arabia, filling up hotels and guest palaces. The president offered to send a squadron of F-15s, but King Fahd was hesitant, which made Bush fear that the Saudis were also considering appeasement. But King Fahd would go further rhetorically than the president had anticipated. He is conceited. He doesn't realize that the implications of his actions are upsetting the world order. He seems to think only of himself. He is following Hitler and creating world problems, with a difference. One was conceited, and one is both conceited and crazy. I believe nothing will work with Saddam but the use of force. He is a liar. Saddam must be taught a lesson he will not forget the rest of his life, if he remains alive. Throughout this and future conflicts with Saddam's Iraq, comparisons to Adolf Hitler in World War II would become widespread. This was especially the case for President Bush himself. Many criticize this as a rhetorical trap in order to force people into supporting the war. I mean, after all, what does it say about you if you say no to trying to stop the next Hitler? But despite all these criticisms, I think we should probably take a moment to consider that these were the actual, genuine feelings of President Bush and his administration. First of all, it's worth reminding people that President Bush was a veteran of World War II, serving as a naval aviator in the Pacific Theater. Most of the men of his generation had a habit of comparing every conflict to World War II because that was their personal experience. On top of that, President Bush's thoughts were also being influenced by Martin Gilbert's 1989 book, the Second World War a complete history. And throughout his own memoir, President Bush makes frequent comparisons between Hitler and Hussein and between the atrocities in Poland and the atrocities in Kuwait. But he wouldn't be the only ones to analogize this conflict to World War II and Hitler. In a New York Times article, William Safire would write, "If anyone wondered whether this analogy of Saddam Hussein to a predecessor aggressor and mass murderer, Adolf Hitler, might be an exaggeration, all doubt was removed yesterday. If we negotiated with the kidnapper, we would save the lives of these children, at the cost of tens of thousands, perhaps millions of other children sure to be incinerated when Saddam acquires nuclear bombs. President Bush's choice is Hobson's choice. That is, no choice at all." Abe Rosenthal would take these concerns a step further, not just utilizing Saddam's warlike nature, but also drawing on Hussein and Hitler's shared antipathy for the Jews, raising concerns for the state of Israel. If he wins, he will turn the attack against Israel. He will lead the final holy war as the one true Muslim conqueror, crying destruction to the Jews and death to all Arabs who question his vision, course, and glory. We can all see now the only puzzle about Saddam Hussein's conquest of Kuwait is why the world refused to see it coming. Even that is no vast mystery. The West and the Soviet Union helped create this man of evil dreams. They simply refused to believe he would turn against them, not after they had supplied him with the weapons and loans and all. Left-leaning journalists and pundits were frequently critical of this comparison to Hitler and the Nazis, but they weren't the only ones. Lest you think division over foreign policy is a modern ailment to the GOP or the American right, it was present back in the 90s as well. One of the leading critics was Patrick Buchanan, a former speechwriter for President Nixon and White House communications director under Reagan. He would also criticize this tendency to compare every conflict to World War II and every foreign dictator to Hitler. Buchanan was one of the paleoconservatives who rebranded their isolationism as non-interventionism, and in his 2008 book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, goes on to criticize the neoconservative urge to repeat World War II triumphalism, which he refers to as the cult of Churchill, the urge to liberate a foreign peoples from a dictator and be praised by them in the streets. And although this idea was less refined back in 1990, it was still there, and he argued that it was a serious dividing point on the right. The Gulf crisis has brought to the surface of our politics a deep fissure on the right. On one side, the old right, the traditionalists who seized the GOP away from the Rockefeller Eastern establishment for Barry Goldwater in 1964 and went on to nominate Ronald Reagan in 1980. On the other, the neoconservatives, ex-liberal Democrats who got their baptismal certificates at the Reagan Transition Office. And if you'll allow me a quick tangent, I find this rewriting of the history of the American right to be kinda funny. If you know anything about it, you'll know that the Venn diagram between the Goldwaterites and neoconservatives is a nearly perfect circle. The idea that the guy who wanted to use nukes in Vietnam was aligned with isolationists on foreign policy is laughable. In the early years, Buchanan was against the Reagan administration and its foreign policy, and it's only after he was brought into the White House that he changed his tune somewhat. And since Reagan was the most popular Republican and conservative in the country, Buchanan was trying to rewrite the history of the paleocons in order to incorporate this very popular figure into his movement so that he could claim to be Reagan's rightful successor. Anyways, with that tangent out of the way, let's get back to the story. During the invasion, Secretary of State James Baker was in Siberia meeting with Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze on a tour of the Soviet Far East, and thus couldn't be there for either the NSC meetings or the Security Council resolutions. During the Irkutsk meeting, we spoke in a theoretical way about the end of the Cold War, and the improvement of relations between the USSR and the United States could create a certain vacuum in various regions of the world, especially during the early stage, and that crises spawned by regional hegemonic tendencies could fill it. The two were in a meeting when one of Baker's assistants handed him a note, with both learning about it at the same time. The Soviets, who had also been following Saddam's troop buildup via satellites prior to August 2nd, had been under the same impression as the Arab leaders, believing that Saddam was just trying to strong-arm the Kuwaitis into forgiving Iraqi debts. But on August 3rd, he and Shevardnadze signed a joint statement on the Gulf crisis, condemning the invasion, after which Baker would ask the Soviets to join the U.S. in their arms embargo of Iraq. After his return from Aspen, President Bush had more meetings with defense and intelligence officials. CIA Director Bill Webster informed the NSC that Iraqi forces were less than a mile from the border with Saudi Arabia, and that Yemen and Jordan would either support Saddam's efforts or not cooperate with UN boycotts. Deputy Secretary of State Larry Eagleburger suggested they invoke Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which authorized military force and economic sanctions. But Bush wanted to hold off on that, wanting to give Egypt and Saudi Arabia time to get an Arab solution to work. Powell's presentation showed them what units and assets could be sent to the Persian Gulf immediately, emphasizing the need to move quickly, and also brought up the question of whether Kuwait was worth going to war over. Dick Cheney seconded the need for speed, reiterating that the longer the Iraqis were allowed to stay in Kuwait, the harder it would be to expel them militarily. But it's important to plant the American flag in the Saudi desert as soon as possible, assuming we can get there okay. The potential for another hostage crisis was a growing concern as well, with 15 American citizens already having been arrested by the Iraqis. After the meeting, the president would briefly speak with the press about the developments.
The status quo is unacceptable, and further expansion would be even more unacceptable. And there are a lot of options. I'm not going to discuss what they are. We've already taken economic steps, and all options are open, economic and otherwise. Yes?
Mr. President, do you feel your hands are tied until these Arab meetings conclude and they decide what they're going to do?
No, I support the fact that foreign ministers have met in Cairo. I'm very pleased that there's active diplomacy going on in Saudi Arabia. High-level official from Iraq meeting today, as I understand it, with the top officials in Saudi Arabia. All that is good, but my hands aren't tied in terms of having to wait for somebody else in any way. But there's a certain complication to all of this that requires a certain amount of time. It's not an easy matter in any sense, economically, militarily, anything else.
It was 2 days into the crisis, and the Saudis were still reluctant to allow U.S. troops into their country, despite the fact that they were receiving many of the same intelligence reports about Iraqi troops nearing the Saudi border. Various U.S. officials would meet with Ambassador Bandar to get him to convince King Fahd to allow U.S. troops into Saudi Arabia. There were various reasons for Saudi hesitancy, such as the impact thousands of U.S. soldiers might have on Saudi society and politics. But more immediately concerning was the perceived track record of the U.S. in Middle Eastern affairs, as well as their commitment to long-term foreign deployment. There was the U.S. support of Israel, which was incredibly unpopular in the Arab streets. Additionally, when the Shah was deposed in the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the U.S. did nothing to restore him to power. Then there was the issue of Vietnam. Not only had the U.S. pulled out before the North was fully dealt with, but when the North finally did attack, the Ford administration broke the promise President Nixon had made to come to Saigon's defense. And this same issue was repeated in Lebanon in 1984. As soon as the occupation got tough, President Reagan pulled the troops out, leaving Amin Jamal, the Maronites, and Israelis to deal with the Syrians and their proxies alone. Secretary Cheney would meet with Prince Bandar at the Pentagon, where he showed their preliminary plans to deliver 200,000 soldiers to the region, and to emphasize that the U.S. was determined to stay as long as needed, or as long as the Saudis wanted. President Bush would continue his phone diplomacy into the afternoon, speaking with President François Mitterrand of France, who preferred to employ economic sanctions rather than military action. He also spoke with President Turgut Özal of Turkey, whom Bush needed to go along with the oil embargo. There were two active pipelines that connected Iraqi oil to the international market. The IPSA, which took oil from Al-Zubair to Al-Mu'ajiz in Saudi Arabia, and the ITCOP, which brought oil from Kirkuk to Ceyhan in Turkey. The Saudis were already planning to shut down the IPSA, and Bush needed Turkey to shut down the ITCOP. Doing this would leave the Gulf as the only major artery for Iraqi oil, which could be policed by the American and Royal Navies. Özal was willing to go along with the embargo, but this had been a major source of revenue for the Turkish government, and he would need some kind of compensation, which was provided by the Gulf states with encouragement from Margaret Thatcher, as well as additional loans from the World Bank arranged by James Baker. Özal also warned Bush that the Jordanians would likely help Saddam evade the sanctions by delivering oil by truck to Jordan, and then exporting it through the port of Aqaba, and that Saddam was planning on annexing Kuwait. But he also claimed that Saddam's military was far more fragile than it appeared, calling it a hollow army. Özal would go a step further, not just advocating his expulsion from Kuwait. Are we going to get rid of Saddam Hussein? We are prevented by law from taking actions to assassinate foreign officials. Our focus now is to strangle him through political and economic sanctions. We need to finish him off. Every state is vulnerable if Saddam Hussein continues to exist. We will be in perpetual danger. Please tell President Bush that he has to go. The NSC met at Camp David on August 4th, where the president hoped to make some important decisions. General Schwarzkopf and Colin Powell present a plan for a troop buildup in Saudi Arabia, and an eventual land invasion of Kuwait. But General Schwarzkopf warned that they didn't have enough men or resources in the region to stop Saddam if they decided to invade anytime that month, and that it would take at least 8 months to deliver everything they needed to defend the Saudis and liberate Kuwait. What I've discussed so far is a contingency plan for the defense of Saudi Arabia. If we ever wanted to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait, we'd have to go on the offense, and that would take a whole lot more troops and a whole lot more time. By this point, the invasion was 3 days old, and the Saudis were still refusing to permit U.S. troops into the country. Secretary Cheney emphasizes the need to use force to protect Saudi Arabia and to restore the Kuwaiti government. But the president still feared that King Fahd might take the path of least resistance and appease Saddam's ambitions in Kuwait. The U.S. needed a regional base from which to attack Iraq. The Israelis would have been willing to host American forces and allow an attack from their territory, but this would have turned the entire Arab world against the U.S. Turkey was already an American ally, and it had the infrastructure needed to host the troops, but it was too geographically distanced from Kuwait. There was also the concern that it could drag the rest of NATO into the conflict. They eventually came to a consensus. They would pursue economic sanctions through the UN and allied governments, while building up a ground force in Saudi Arabia to deter an Iraqi attack. All that was left was to convince King Fahd to allow U.S. forces on Saudi soil. President Bush would call King Fahd again, asking him for permission to send troops. But King Fahd wanted to meet with the defense secretary first, but Bush refused to send Cheney to Riyadh unless they already had an agreement to send troops. Brent Scowcroft would meet with Ambassador Bandar, asking him to convince King Fahd to approve troop deployment, and promised a visit from Cheney if he did. After a quick call from Bandar, King Fahd would agree. We will get the team underway. Another point I want to make here involves a world of honor. The security of Saudi Arabia is vital, basically fundamental to U.S. interests, and really to the interests of the Western world. And I am determined that Saddam will not get away with all this infamy. When we work out a plan, once we are there, we will stay until we are asked to leave. You have my solemn word on this. While the U.S. was busy trying to get permission to send troops into the Gulf, the Arab League met in Cairo in order to find a resolution to the crisis before outside intervention was needed. The Bush administration feared that the longer the occupation went on, the more Arab governments would begin complying with Saddam by recognizing the puppet government installed in Kuwait. There was also the fear that Saddam would force a split in the Arab world by launching an attack on Israel. And I think it's important to understand this dichotomy in the Middle East. Their governments aren't perfect reflections of what the people want. Now, this can be said about most countries in general, but this is of a different scale in the Middle East, especially when these regimes are very often unstable. Most governments in the region have refused to grant diplomatic recognition to Israel because they fear societal unrest. Failures in conflicts with the Israelis have triggered numerous coups since 1948. Social and economic reforms have triggered riots and revolutions, some of which successfully toppled centuries-old monarchies. In particular, the cause of the Palestinians is very important to the average Arab on the street, with their governments being far more moderate on the issue. The Arab public hates Israel, and they hate the West, and dictators like Saddam, Assad, and Gaddafi were valorized as resistors of imperialist infidels. But not everyone shares the Western, and especially the European, perception of Saddam Hussein as another Hitler, without Hitler's charm. Nor would such comparison be seen by all as a wholly negative. In the Middle East, some other perceptions have been expressed. The rulers of Kuwait, and by implication others like them, were Western lackeys, agents of foreign imperialism in Arab lands, and toward the liberation and unification of the Arab world. In this perception, he is the heir of Nasser, of Saladin, and, in his own rhetoric, of Nebuchadnezzar. He will resume and complete the unfinished work of Nasser, and deal with the enemies of the Arabs. Saddam had become very popular amongst the Palestinians for his incessant ravings against the evil Zionists and their masters in Washington. This would lead Yasser Arafat and the PLO to support the invasion. Part of Arafat's reasoning was needing to find another patron for the PLO. The Egyptians had lost their confidence after the Camp David Accords, and he broke ties with Syria when Assad began backing rival Palestinian groups. This left Saddam Hussein, who had been a backer of another rival group, Abu Nidal. Allying with Saddam would create an informal alliance with Abu Nidal and provide them the generous resources of Baghdad. And so, although Saddam had earned the ire of fellow Arab leaders, he was a hero in the Arab streets. After all, who else was standing up to the Americans and the Zionists? The NSC met again on the 5th, receiving additional reports about the movement of Iraqi troops toward the Saudi border, despite the Indian Ocean carrier group dispatched on the 1st still several days away. They also received reports that American and British citizens were being rounded up and sent to Baghdad. In retrospect, if Saddam had wanted to make a go for Saudi Arabia, he probably made a mistake in that he did not do it in this brief window. If he had, he would have had a free run. After the talks with King Fahd, President Bush would debate the necessity of getting a UN authorization with Margaret Thatcher and Brent Scowcroft. Thatcher believed that between the original UN resolution and Article 51 of the UN Charter, they had all the authority they needed to embargo Iraq. Scowcroft, however, feared using the term blockade, which was considered an act of war in international law, to which he suggested they call it a quarantine, citing the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Upon his return to the White House deboarding Marine Force One, the president would give a quick response to the journalists waiting for him.
This will not stand. This will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait. I've got to go.
Secretary Cheney and General Schwarzkopf visit Saudi Arabia, where they received the formal request to deploy U.S. soldiers to the peninsula, with both parties agreeing to keep the decision silent until the first U.S. forces arrived, fearing Saddam would use the public announcement as an excuse to invade. We are prepared to deploy these forces to defend the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. If you ask us, we will come. We will seek no permanent bases, and when you ask us to go home, we will leave. General Schwarzkopf had shown King Fahd satellite photos of the Iraqi army along the border, as well as a few instances of Iraqi tanks actually crossing the border momentarily. After the meeting, Cheney gave Powell the official order to start moving troops. Although this decision was intended to be kept secret, some of the command orders accidentally went out uncoded, and it was only a matter of time before reporters began noticing a lot of movement at U.S. military bases. There were also bureaucratic hurdles to overcome. The early 90s was a transitional period for the American Armed Forces. They were on the verge of a massive decrease in spending as well as a reduction in manpower, which some referred to as the peace dividend. But it was also transitional in terms of operations. At this point, the technology to manage troop deployments and supply requisitions digitally was at the Pentagon's disposal, but they still needed to enter all of the data into the system manually, and doing so properly would take at least a year. But the Pentagon now had a huge order of troops to deploy. If they waited till the data entry process was finished, Saddam might be too entrenched and dug in to expel by force. But if they didn't, they would have to deal with the bureaucratic paperwork by hand. Given these choices, they opted for the latter, making the Gulf War the last pre-computer war, at least in terms of bureaucratic management. The president would meet with numerous leaders at his vacation home in Maine, including Prime Minister Brian Mulroney of Canada, who was a surprising font of intelligence. He told President Bush about a meeting between Hosni Mubarak and Tariq Aziz, who tried to bribe Egypt into supporting the war.
The Iraqi came in and announced that Kuwait has $500 billion that they can put their hands on. They were trying to tell Mubarak that there would be $20 billion for Egypt if Egypt supported Iraq. What clearly happened is that the Iraqis have just robbed the bank and will split it up with whoever will support them.
Prime Minister Mulroney and I have had a very good discussion, talked about bilateral matters, but also, obviously, about the situation regarding Iraq and Canada. A member of the Security Council has been not only in a role of leadership there, but side by side with the United States and others. And I told the Prime Minister that I'm very grateful for Canada's position. As we all know, they've contributed to this, I believe it's now 22-nation international force, both on the land and Canada's participation on the sea, ours also, as well as land. And so we're very grateful to them.
Along with all members of the Government of Canada and the people of Canada, we're very pleased with the decision of the United Nations Security Council to provide what I believe is quite unprecedented leadership. Certainly one of the most important days of the United Nations since its foundation have been the series of resolutions in respect of Iraq, where the United Nations, as one, the Security Council, dealt effectively and well with a rogue leader who sought to annex another nation and believed that he could conduct himself with impunity both vis-a-vis his Arab neighbors and the world. And the world turned against him in a quite extraordinary manner. And that is to the credit of the United Nations and those who, pursuant to the lead of the United States under President Bush, of like-minded nations who participated in what we believe is a very important initiative to curb aggression in the Middle East.
Mubarak, who later corroborated the story, believed that Saddam had made the same offer to Jordan, Yemen, and Sudan. Saddam would visit Yemen in the early weeks of the crisis and warn President Saleh that the U.S. would attack both of them with atomic weapons, and that he would respond to the blockades with suicide bombers. August 6th is when the Iraqi hostage crisis began, with Saddam banning foreign nationals from leaving the country, after which he began to take hostages from countries joining Bush's international coalition, including UN staff and officials. Those from the UK and US would be used as human shields, being held at various valuable installations across the country. I remembered all too well the international and domestic perception of the Carter administration during the Tehran hostage crisis. It had appeared that America's hands were tied, and that the attention of its president was controlled by thugs. I was absolutely determined that the American people would be spared this a second time. I wanted them and Saddam Hussein to see not only that the president had the situation under control, but also that he was unworried and confident. If the Iraqis started executing U.S. embassy employees, say, and the president wanted to retaliate, Central Command had little to offer short of a nuclear strike on Baghdad. Back in Baghdad, Saddam meets with Joseph Wilson, the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires, and asks Wilson for a guarantee that the U.S. won't attack Iraq. He would try to buy off the Americans by promising to provide cheap oil, and promise not to attack Saudi Arabia, but he also threatened to foment popular violence across the Middle East. If what President Bush wants, in fact, is the preservation of U.S. interests as he has described them, then escalation of tension and a military alternative is against these interests. I will tell you how you will be defeated. You are a superpower, and I know you can hurt us, but you will lose the whole area. You will never bring us to our knees. You can destroy some of our economic and industrial base, but the greater damage you cause, the greater the burden to you. In such a situation, we will not remain idle in the region. Convey to President Bush that he should regard the Kuwaiti Emir and Crown Prince as history. We will never leave Kuwait for someone else to take. We would never let Kuwait be an easy bite, even if the whole world were against us. We would fight on. We know you are the superpower who can do great damage to us, but we will never capitulate. But while Saddam was busy trying to carrot and stick the U.S., the Security Council was passing Resolution 661, enacting sanctions, after which both Turkey and Saudi Arabia shut off their oil pipelines from Iraq. On August 8th, President Bush would formally announce the deployment of U.S. forces to Saudi Arabia after the arrival of the 82nd Airborne, at which point he demanded the unconditional withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait, and the restoration of the Kuwaiti monarchy.
In the life of a nation, we're called upon to define who we are and what we believe. Sometimes these choices are not easy. But today, as president, I ask for your support in a decision I've made to stand up for what's right and condemn what's wrong, all in the cause of peace. In my direction, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia. I took this action to assist the Saudi Arabian government in the defense of its homeland. No one commits America's armed forces to a dangerous mission lightly, but after perhaps unparalleled international consultation and exhausting every alternative, it became necessary to take this action. And let me tell you why. Less than a week ago, in the early morning hours of August 2nd, Iraqi armed forces, without provocation or warning, invaded a peaceful Kuwait. Facing negligible resistance from its much smaller neighbor, Iraq's tanks stormed in blitzkrieg fashion through Kuwait in a few short hours. With more than 100,000 troops, along with tanks, artillery, and surface-to-surface missiles, Iraq now occupies Kuwait. This aggression came just hours after Saddam Hussein specifically assured numerous countries in the area that there would be no invasion. there is no justification whatsoever for this outrageous and brutal act of aggression. A puppet regime imposed from the outside is unacceptable. The acquisition of territory by force is unacceptable. No one, friend or foe, should doubt our desire for peace, and no one should underestimate our determination to confront aggression.
This was followed by Oman agreeing to support U.S. operations in the region, and the United Arab Emirates agreeing to host U.S. troops as well. The UK, Canada, and Australia would also promise additional naval support in the Gulf. Even the Soviets offered a perfunctory ship for the international flotilla. Everyone wanted some sort of cover to protect themselves against any backlash. Ozal hoped his moves would be cloaked by NATO. Fahd did not wish to be the only Arab state opposing Iraq. Hawke didn't want to be the single Commonwealth country joining the coalition. We needed to demonstrate that this action was not a solo American effort against an Arab state. King Fahd initially approved 100,000 troops to be stationed in Saudi Arabia. Both the Soviets and French agreed to an arms embargo against Iraq, and China, still recovering from the backlash of the Tiananmen Square massacre, agreed not to oppose the efforts against Saddam. Secretary Cheney would get permission from Hosni Mubarak to allow nuclear-powered aircraft carriers through the Suez Canal, while also getting both Egypt and Morocco to commit troops to defend Saudi Arabia. But on August 8th, Baghdad announced the annexation of Kuwait, and named Saddam's cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, as the governor of the new province. And in case you forgot, al-Majid was the person Saddam put in charge of Kurdistan toward the end of the Iran-Iraq War, who orchestrated the Al-Anfal campaign and the genocide of the Kurds. He would begin extracting Kuwaiti wealth, calling for the economic retardation of Kuwait and for the eradication of the Kuwaiti identity. This included removing all references to the royal family from public property and the destruction of all literature referring to Kuwait as an independent country. And this news came out alongside reports of other atrocities. The Arab League held another emergency meeting in Cairo, where 12 of 21 members voted to send a pan-Arab force to Saudi Arabia, with Egyptian and Moroccan troops arriving first. NATO met that same day to condemn Iraq's actions up to that point, and approved individual members of NATO being involved in the coalition. In response to this, Saddam declared a holy war against Israel and the United States, but offered to withdraw from Kuwait if Israel withdrew from Arab territory. Like most Arab despots, Saddam believed that Israel was a puppet of the United States, and that everything it did was either at American behest or was done with Washington's blessings. He would try to reframe his invasion as rectifying a crime of colonialism, placing Kuwait in the same category the Arab world placed the State of Israel. It was at this point the president began sending serious messages to Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, trying to keep the Israelis out of the conflict. As the days went on, the Bush administration feared it was getting harder and harder to actually expel Saddam from Kuwait. The pressure to avoid a ground war was high, with foreign diplomats wanting the sanctions to play out. But the president and his cabinet feared that the amount of time needed for sanctions to work would leave the Iraqi army so entrenched in Kuwait that they couldn't be expelled by force. The Joint Chiefs showed the president how long it would take to get the necessary number of soldiers there to fully defend Saudi Arabia, and then how much longer it would take to get enough to militarily expel Saddam. The US had other military commitments, and it takes weeks or months to go from requisitioning manpower and supplies to actual deployment. Given the slow machinery of bureaucracy, Colin Powell told him that if they were going to go ahead with an assault on Kuwait, they would need to make that decision by mid-October.
Mr. President, is there any hope at all of a diplomatic solution to this crisis?
I don't see it right now, but as the sanctions begin to take effect, it's going to take a while, I would hope there would be a diplomatic solution to this crisis.
Assuming that Saddam Hussein were to work out some face-saving way to withdraw from Kuwait, he would still be there with a very large army, still presumably intimidating to his neighbors, having invaded once. Given all that, do you think it is possible for this crisis ultimately to be resolved without removing Saddam Hussein from power, and if so, how?
All I want to do is see it resolved the way that the world opinion wants it resolved, and then we will worry about the rest of that later on. But the main thing is to have the withdrawal and the restoration of the rulers to their responsibilities. And so it's too hypothetical for me to go into what happens beyond that, But yes, I'd like to feel that that can still happen. And the economic sanctions are just beginning to, Marlon says pinch, I'd say bite. And I think that they're going to be quite effective, more so than in the past. I certainly hope so. So let's just see how all that works.
On August 18th, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 664, demanding that Iraq allow all foreigners to leave Iraq and Kuwait, to which Saddam offered to release its hostages if the U.S. pulled out of Saudi Arabia. Secretary General Cuellar visited Baghdad the day before, attempting to get Saddam to release UN staff as well as other third-party civilians not involved in this conflict prior to the resolution's passage, warning of dire consequences if Iraq doesn't begin complying with them. President Bush hesitated in issuing an ultimatum to Iraq to release the hostages, fearing this could cause a premature clash before coalition forces were prepared. Despite this, other famous individuals, celebrities, and politicians would visit Baghdad, receive a lavish welcome and photo op with Saddam, and then come home with a dozen or so hostages. 5 tankers from Iraq were headed out of the Gulf, and the administration members, as well as foreign coalition leaders, were in disagreement over how the U.S. could unilaterally enforce the sanctions. President Bush, Secretary Cheney, and Deputy National Security Advisor Robert Gates, along with Margaret Thatcher, encouraged unilateral action. But the French, Canadians, and Soviets believed the U.S. required a separate UN resolution authorizing enforcement due to the original resolution being too vague. Secretary Baker also encouraged the administration to seek another UN resolution, not because he believed it was legally necessary, but because it was politically necessary to keep the Soviets and French in the coalition, both of whom had permanent seats on the Security Council and were thus vital in keeping up the international pressure on Saddam. The tankers would reach Yemen before the coalition could decide on enforcement. 2 of the empty tankers began sailing back to Iraq, and Central Command was uncertain of how to respond and decided to take a cautious interpretation of the UN resolution, allowing the empty ships to continue. The administration back in Washington called Schwarzkopf to complain about the decision and told him to stop the next ship that came through. The next day, a fully loaded tanker was headed out of the Gulf, and the USS Reed would fire several warning shots, but it refused to stop. Central Command then received additional instructions telling them not to sink any ship without White House approval, and after that to give the ship's crew a chance to evacuate before sinking it. This was creating a diplomatic crisis in the White House, with the Soviets threatening to withdraw their support from the coalition if the U.S. continued to act unilaterally. President Bush would tell Gorbachev that they would hold off on enforcement of the sanctions, but that they expected them to vote in support of them in the Security Council. The next morning, Colin Powell would give Central Command new instructions to just track Iraqi ships until a UN resolution authorizing enforcement was passed. We were off the hook until daybreak, having been treated to a classic illustration of what happens when Washington tries to direct combat operations from afar. Under most circumstances, being micromanaged would have made me furious, but in this case, I didn't mind. In September, James Baker began his Tin Cup tour traveling around Europe and the Middle East, looking for coalition partners to financially contribute to the Desert Shield, especially from those not sending troops or ships. Baker would also help Hosni Mubarak by getting Congress to write off some of Egypt's debts, due to the reduction in travel through the Suez during the crisis. Secretary General Cuellar also visits Baghdad again, pleading with Tariq Aziz to give some kind of sign that the occupation and annexation of Kuwait was not irreversible, to which Aziz claimed that Iraq had not started these hostilities and that he would only accept an Arab solution. The British would also use their diplomatic resources to support the coalition, such as when Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd visited the Gulf in September, meeting with the Sheikh of the UAE, the Sultan of Oman, and even King Hussein, who was trying to split the difference between Saddam and the coalition by opposing military intervention while also opposing the annexation of Kuwait. On September 6th, Parliament voted 437 to 35 to support Thatcher's policy on the crisis, which became even more certain of the necessity for military force, which began arriving in Saudi Arabia. The Gulf crisis was the most unified and coherent the United Nations had ever been. Even the Korean War wasn't as unifying, due to the USSR boycotting its decision rather than using its prerogative to veto the resolution approving the intervention. Other than that, the last time the US and Soviet Union were in unison on an international conflict was the Suez Crisis, when President Eisenhower and Premier Khrushchev jointly told the Israelis, French, and British to pull out of the Sinai. It's the cooperation of the Soviet Union with the US and the Security Council that has made these efforts possible so far. But getting Gorbachev and Shevardnadze to go along with anything was like pulling teeth for the Bush administration. And this was a consequence of the relationship between Iraq and the Soviet Union. The USSR had provided Iraq with its first nuclear reactor in the 1950s and supported the coup in 1958. Even after the 1968 coup brought the Baathists to power, they were quick to ally with Saddam, who condemned the party's anti-communist purge of 1963. He even gave Soviet officials a warning about the rightward shift in Arab politics in the early 70s, noting Anwar Sadat's more open embrace of Islam than Nasser had. This relationship became more hopeful in the mid-70s when the Baathists nationalized the Iraqi Petroleum Company and signed an accord with Comecon in 1975. But this high point was followed by a series of purges in the late 70s under the guise of rooting out foreign spies and traitors, largely targeting Shia Muslims. Despite this, the Soviets continued arming the Iraqis, only briefly halting arms sales after the start of the Iran-Iraq War, which Saddam had told the Soviets wasn't going to happen. Although it never said so publicly, Moscow strongly disapproved of the Iraqi invasion of Iran, but not because the attack was unexpected, as the Soviets had indeed considered an invasion to be an imminent possibility. Rather, Iraq's unwillingness to consult the Kremlin was seen as an attempt by Saddam to drag the Soviet Union into his military adventure, on the assumption that Moscow would automatically support whatever he did. It was this long relationship with Saddam, along with the Soviet Union's shrinking influence, that made them hesitant to throw their last Middle Eastern client under the bus. And this would be the background of the 1990 Helsinki Summit between President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev. The US still had its Cold War military budget, and the Soviet Union was disintegrating before everyone's eyes, with Gorbachev having a close relationship with President Bush. The UN didn't have a very good track record of preventing wars or in getting much done at all due to the antagonism between the US and USSR, but this brief window of Russo-American rapprochement would allow the UN and international community to be more organized than at any point before. There were forces within Gorbachev's government, however, that wanted to save Saddam from himself, and so Gorbachev would try to slow walk the international pressure every step of the way, which is why Gorbachev and Bush would meet in Helsinki, Finland, to hopefully solidify their course. I want to work with you as equal partners in dealing with this. I want to go to the American people tomorrow night to close the book on the Cold War and offer them the vision of this new world order in which we will cooperate. The Soviets' long relationship with Saddam and Iraq was a holdover from their stance in the Arab-Israeli conflict, having sided with the Arabs, supporting one or more regime as client states, starting with Egypt under Nasser, switching over to Syria after the Yom Kippur War, and then to Iraq in the 1980s. With their influence across the world collapsing, Soviet hardliners wanted to retain some semblance of influence to satiate their egos. Combine this with an economy in freefall and you can see the pressure Gorbachev was under, trying to appease both the hardliners and the reformers. Despite this, Gorbachev would go along with Bush's plans, even if he had to be dragged every step of the way. Bush came to Helsinki in order to reaffirm Gorbachev's support for the campaign against Iraq, while Gorbachev wanted to find a resolution that would allow Saddam to save face, suggesting that Saddam's withdrawal from Kuwait should be followed by an international conference to resolve all other outstanding issues in the region. President Bush strongly rejected this proposal, believing it would give Saddam the credit for trying to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, thus rewarding him for unjustified aggression, and making him a hero of the Arab and Islamic worlds. Bush tried to assuage Gorbachev's fears by offering Soviet troops a spot on the ground in Desert Shield, and assured him that the US had no plans to keep a large force in the Gulf afterwards. Gorbachev countered, claiming that the US had already succeeded in deterring further aggression from Saddam, and now just needed to find a way to peacefully remove Iraqi troops from Kuwait, and that letting Saddam save face was the best way to do so, believing Saddam would reject any offer short of that. But again, Bush rejected any option that he believed would empower Saddam. However, Gorbachev insisted that they could convince Saddam to withdraw willingly. This was not the first time they had promised this. Back in August, Shevardnadze had made the same promise to Secretary Baker, but it failed to materialize. But this time, Gorbachev was sending a member of his presidential council, Yevgeny Primakov. Primakov had been a correspondent for Pravda and Soviet radio during the 50s and 60s, and first met Saddam in Egypt while he was in exile. Based on his personal relationship with the Iraqi leader, Primakov believed that Saddam thought he was too valuable to the US for him to be ousted, and thus took the risk of invading Kuwait. Primakov was also under the impression that Saddam, at some point, was a CIA asset. Now, there's no evidence of this whatsoever, but this is par for the course for the Soviets, for whom most left-wing conspiracy theories can be traced back to. One important piece of information the Soviets did provide about Saddam, though, was that he seemed to not understand the geopolitical situation he was in. He was under the impression that most of the world supported him, and both Gorbachev and Primakov believed Saddam's ministers and advisors were keeping him in the dark in order to appease his ego. The Iraqi leadership was behind the times internationally. They clung to the idea, which had taken root in the confrontational era, that in the event of a crisis in this part of the world, the United States and the Soviet Union would inevitably wind up on opposite sides of the barricades. In his memoirs, Gorbachev recounts a conversation he had with Tariq Aziz just a few days before the Helsinki Summit. And in this interaction, he appears to give the Iraqis every chance possible to avoid conflict and resolve the situation peacefully. For us, the purpose of this conversation is to see whether the Iraqi leadership has any new ideas that might facilitate a political settlement. This is why we wanted you to come here on the eve of the meeting with Bush. We have collaborated with you in the past and would like to continue this collaboration. We have been searching for years for the key to the most important problems of the Middle East, especially the Palestinian problem, the Arab-Israeli conflict as a whole, and the Lebanese crisis. Now, after what Iraq has done, the task has become complicated many times over. It is unrealistic after all that has happened to talk about negotiations without displaying a readiness to withdraw Iraqi troops from Kuwait. After the summit, Baker would travel to Moscow, where Gorbachev and Shevardnadze requested Baker ask the Saudis for a $4 billion loan in order to shore up the free-falling Soviet economy, which Baker agreed to, as well as giving reassurances to the Soviets that the U.S. would lay some groundwork for a Middle East peace conference after the crisis. When President Bush returned to Washington, he began using his popular support to pressure Congress into supporting his actions in the Gulf with an official vote.
So tonight, I want to talk to you about what's at stake, what we must do together to defend civilized values around the world and maintain our economic strength at home. Our objectives in the Persian Gulf are clear, our goals defined and familiar. Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait completely, immediately, and without condition. Kuwait's legitimate government must be restored. The security and stability of the Persian Gulf must be assured, and American citizens abroad must be protected. These goals are not ours alone. They've been endorsed by the United Nations Security Council 5 times in as many weeks. Most countries share our concern for principle, and many have a stake in the stability of the Persian Gulf. This is not, as Saddam Hussein would have it, the United States against Iraq. It is Iraq against the world.
And the next day, he would broadcast a message intended for the Iraqi people.
I'm here today to explain to the people of Iraq why the United States and the world community has responded the way it has to Iraq's occupation of Kuwait. My purpose is not to trade accusations, not to escalate the war of words, but to speak with candor about what has caused this crisis that confronts us. Let there be no misunderstanding. We have no quarrel with the people of Iraq. I've said many times, and I will repeat right now, our only object is to oppose the invasion ordered by Saddam Hussein. On August 2nd, your leadership made its decision to invade, an unprovoked attack on a small nation that posed no threat to your own. Kuwait was the victim, Iraq the aggressor, and the world met Iraq's invasion with a chorus of condemnation, unanimous resolutions in the United Nations. 27 states, rich and poor, Arab, Muslim, Asian, and African, have answered the call of Saudi Arabia and free Kuwait and sent forces to the Gulf region to defend against Iraq. I do not believe that you, the people of Iraq, want war. No one knows better than you the incalculable costs of war, the ultimate cost when a nation's vast potential and vital energies are consumed by conflict. No one knows what Iraq might be today, what prosperity and peace you might now enjoy had your leaders not plunged you into war. Now, once again, Iraq finds itself on the brink of war. Once again, the same Iraqi leadership is miscalculated. Once again, the Iraqi people face tragedy. Saddam Hussein has told you that Iraqi troops were invited into Kuwait. That's not true. In fact, in the face of far superior force, the people of Kuwait are bravely resisting this occupation. Your own returning soldiers will tell you the Kuwaitis are fighting valiantly in any way they can. Saddam Hussein tells you that this crisis is a struggle between Iraq and America. In fact, it is Iraq against the world.
The White House, filled with veterans of the Nixon and Reagan administrations, wanted to avoid what they believed were the strategic and political mistakes of Vietnam and Beirut. The military mistakes were being accounted for by approving the use of overwhelming force to defend Saudi Arabia, but most officials in the White House and Pentagon were far more concerned with the political mistakes, viewing both Vietnam and Lebanon as failures of the administration to outline a clear goal and build domestic support. President Bush would address these concerns by making the moral case, emphasizing the inhumane nature of the invasion and of Saddam's regime.
These developments not only underscore the brutal behavior of Iraq, but also the international support that exists and is marshaled against Iraq's occupation of Kuwait. I've often said that it is not the United States against Iraq, but Iraq against the world. And for our part, we will continue to do everything possible to ensure that the sanctions work as intended and to deter, and if need be, defend Saudi Arabia against armed attack. And here I just want to reiterate what I said when I first ordered the U.S. forces to Saudi Arabia, namely that the United States forces were sent to Saudi Arabia at the request of the Saudi government, and those same U.S. forces will depart as soon as they are no longer needed or wanted, and they will remain not one day longer than is absolutely necessary.
General Norman Schwarzkopf, a veteran of the Vietnam War and the officer in charge of the Central Command, was organizing the war effort on the ground in Saudi Arabia, and he too was trying to avoid the political missteps of Vietnam. He would craft a set of rules for dealing with the press. Assert your expertise. You don't have to answer all of their questions. Don't answer a question if it would give up information that helps the enemy, but also don't lie. Think back to what caused the disenchantment of the American public with Vietnam. They felt they were constantly being misled with false body counts and optimistic talks about the light at the end of the tunnel. There would be times when my information would be incomplete. I had to resist the temptation to draw rosy conclusions and report them as fact. Saddam would help the coalition members maintain public support in their countries by taking their diplomatic staffs hostage, which the UN Security Council would condemn in Resolution 667. It's around this time that non-American forces started to arrive in Saudi Arabia. Now, given the context, it might be surprising, but the most war-happy powers were the Gulf states themselves, with Saudi troops being stationed on the front line. Gulf leaders would frequently ask the U.S. diplomats and military personnel to hurry up and attack the Iraqis already, making General Schwarzkopf fear triggering a premature fight. The biggest uncertainty was what Saddam would do next. Around the time Saddam started taking diplomats hostage, he had begun to pull his forces away from the Saudi border and replace Republican guards with soldiers from the regular army, having them build up defensive infrastructure. It was at this point that General Schwarzkopf was able to tell the administration that the likelihood of Saddam invading Saudi Arabia was slim, and that he was now hoping to solidify his gains in Kuwait. Despite no longer fearing another Iraqi offensive, Central Command still had to deal with the material needs of the deployment. They borrowed tents from the Saudis used to house pilgrims during the Hajj, as well as festival tents from Germany to shelter coalition troops. But none of this was free, and Central Command was struggling to pay the bills. Despite King Fahd promising to pay for Desert Shield, the day-to-day finances were handled by the Byzantine Saudi bureaucracy, and nearly every official feared approving any expenditures for fear of reprimand from their superiors. In the early weeks of the buildup, it would be Japan that paid for much of the cost, circumventing the Treasury and Congress by transferring funds directly to Central Command. And there were also disputes over what costs King Fahd had actually agreed to cover. The US interpreted his promise as covering all expenses, while the Saudis interpret it as only covering costs incurred from activities in the country, not including the costs of transporting men and material to the Gulf. And this dispute would continue for several months. But the Saudis weren't the only regional power that the coalition needed to deal with. The Egyptians had been aligned with the US since the mid-70s, and were already considered a traitor by much of the Arab world after the Camp David Accords. What the US feared were countries that could cause problems for the coalition. Iran, still reeling from its war with Iraq, was unlikely to interfere in the coalition's efforts. But Syria was another story. Syria and Iraq's relationship was complicated. Both were Ba'athist regimes, but each wanted to be the superior partner in any unified state, which is why Saddam removed his predecessor from power in 1979. When war between Iran and Iraq broke out, Saddam had hoped for Syria to at least support them politically, but Hafez al-Assad decided to prioritize its co-religionist ties with Iran over its pan-Arabist ties with Iraq. And Syria had been a thorn in the side of US policy for most of the 80s. Its intervention in Lebanese affairs, including its support for Palestinian terrorist groups, led to the Israeli invasion in 1982, which resulted in the US sending in the Marines, which Syrian-backed militants would attack and harass until they pulled out. But in the late 80s, there was a change. Various Lebanese and Palestinian terrorist groups and militias would kidnap Western hostages throughout the decade, and different countries had different ways of dealing with them. The US would end up selling arms to the Iranians to get them to force their proxies to release American hostages, but after this scheme, referred to as the Iran-Contra affair, was uncovered, the State Department and CIA would begin reaching out to Hafez al-Assad to serve as the middleman between themselves and the various hostage takers. Syria had been one of the boogeymen of the Reagan administration, having closely aligned themselves with the Soviets. But after Mikhail Gorbachev told Hafez al-Assad that the Soviet Union would no longer support military parity between them and Israel in 1987, Syria decided it needed to pivot toward friendlier relations with the US. And helping free American hostages from its own proxies was an easy first step. Assad not supporting Saddam also repaired the Arab world's perceptions of Syria after it had sided with the Iranians, as well as after fomenting civil war in Lebanon. But there's a difference between simply not supporting Saddam and actively opposing his efforts, which is what the US wanted from Hafez. Most moderate Arab states had supported the coalition, but this would be portrayed by Saddam as corrupt monarchs collaborating with imperialist infidels. What the coalition would need is one or more of the radical Arab states to join the coalition, and so Secretary Baker would meet with Assad to get that support. When you go to Damascus, you are doing something he wants very badly, and you won't get anything from him that he isn't already prepared to do. Baker arrived in Damascus on September 14th, emphasizing the need for Saddam to be thoroughly defeated, not just on the battlefield, but in the Arab psyche. Assad would give vague commitments, unwilling to put a number to the manpower he would send. Despite the coalition growing, the administration was still uncertain what direction it was going to take. Colin Powell supported giving the sanctions as much time to work as they could, but Bush and Scowcroft feared that they would take too long to be effective, or that they might not work at all. This became a bigger concern as the CIA was in agreement with the Israelis on Iraq either having or being on the verge of possessing a nuclear weapon, because the second they proved to have one, Saddam would be untouchable. Sanctions left the initiative with the Iraqis to decide when they had had enough, and history had taught us that sanctions take time, if they work at all. The campaign to build and maintain international support for the coalition continued throughout September, with a big UN meeting on the 30th. President Bush would meet with Margaret Thatcher, where they continued to disagree on whether a Security Council resolution was necessary to use force against Saddam. They also disagreed on the timing of an attack, with Thatcher believing they should attack whenever they felt they were ready, whereas Bush believed that they would need some kind of provocation. Bush also feared a prolonged air campaign, believing the international will for a ground attack would evaporate as Iraq's infrastructure was decimated. However, they were both in agreement that sanctions probably wouldn't work, and that force was the only language Saddam understood. At the summit, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and First Lady Barbara Bush would both get a chance to meet with Queen Noor of Jordan, the wife of King Hussein, who was supporting Iraq against the coalition's efforts. Mulroney would explain to her that the longer the crisis went on, the more likely the coalition would have to use force, while Barbara emphasized the consequences of such a war. Queen Noor would tell them about Saddam needing an off-ramp that would let him save face. Otherwise, he would meet the same fate of other Arab leaders when politically or militarily defeated. She also bemoaned the state of Jordan's economy. The kingdom was overburdened with its own refugee problem, most of whom were Palestinians who were strong supporters of Saddam. A country that is overburdened with problems and has come out on the wrong side of the Iraqi problem. They desperately need money for their refugees, and it is hard to raise. Although Saddam put much of his hopes in the Soviets tripping up the coalition, France was another potential roadblock. Similar to the Soviet Union, France had a history of selling weapons to Iraq as well as many of the components of its nuclear program. And France would rhetorically weaken the coalition when President François Mitterrand spoke to the UN General Assembly. And France would rhetorically weaken the coalition when President François Mitterrand spoke to the UN General Assembly and didn't call for the restoration of the Kuwaiti monarchy after Iraq withdrew. And while Iraq was hoping the Soviets or French would disrupt the coalition's momentum, President Bush feared the Israelis might do so with their own intervention. Since the late 70s, Iraq has been the biggest foreign policy concern of Israel, which resulted in the Israelis destroying the Osirak reactor in 1981, but their concerns didn't go away. Saddam would rebuild his nuclear program during the Iran-Iraq War, and the Israelis suspected that he might be on the verge of successfully building a bomb. They were also concerned with Iraq's manufacture of chemical weapons and their purchase of Soviet missile technology. Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Arens would meet with Defense Secretary Cheney to explain these concerns, which Cheney was sympathetic to. Arens believed that Saddam might try to turn the invasion of Kuwait into an Arab war against Israel, and if photos from US satellites could be provided to Israel so they could get a better glimpse at where the chemical plants and missile launchers were. But Cheney refused, fearing that Israel would use the intelligence to launch an attack on Iraq before the coalition's ground forces were ready to fight, all the while the administration still hadn't decided on its long-term course of action. The specter of the breakup of the coalition was continually held before us. The real objective of President Bush's policy was to cement an image that the United States was a friend of the Arab world. Israeli involvement might tarnish that image. With the possibilities of chemical or biological warfare as real legitimate threats, the Israeli government began a campaign to procure gas masks. But in order to prevent public panic, they decided to do this covertly. But when this campaign leaked, the Shamir government was forced to scour Europe for more gas masks and slowly distribute them. Initially, they didn't distribute gas masks to the residents of the West Bank or Gaza, under the presumption that Saddam wouldn't target fellow Arabs. However, Israeli settlers in the West Bank, along with Arabs in Bethlehem, filed a class action lawsuit demanding equal protection as those living in Israel proper, and the Israeli Supreme Court would eventually order the government to provide gas masks to the residents of the West Bank and Gaza. The issue was exacerbated by a violent incident when an Orthodox Jewish group laid a cornerstone for what they hoped would become the Third Temple on October 8th. This sparked a riot when Palestinians on the Temple Mount began throwing stones at Jews worshipping at the Western Wall. The Israeli border police, who were the nearest security forces present, fired on the stone throwers, killing 17 Palestinians. This incident led to Saddam again publicly tying his withdrawal from Kuwait to Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza. Arab Security Council members drafted a condemnation of Israel, which led to the US and the UK drafting their own condemnation, but in less harsh terms, in order to not only, not anger the Israelis out of fear of them attacking Saddam, but also hopefully enough to appease the Arabs and keep them in the coalition. In early October, General Schwarzkopf was asked to present his preliminary plan for Desert Storm, despite him insisting it wasn't ready. The plan had 4 phases: airstrikes to destroy strategic infrastructure, supply stores, and the Republican Guard, followed by a head-on ground assault into Kuwait. The Joint Chiefs didn't like the 4th phase, which to some felt like a suicide mission. The Deputy National Security Advisor, Robert Gates, accused Schwarzkopf of intentionally presenting them with a terrible plan in order to dissuade the administration from a ground assault. My God, he's already got all the forces he needs. Why won't he attack? Schwarzkopf is just another McClellan. When Powell mentioned the McClellan comment, Schwarzkopf yelled, "You tell me what son of a bitch said that. I'll show him the difference between Schwarzkopf and McClellan." According to Schwarzkopf, Gates had been watching Ken Burns' The Civil War on PBS, and suddenly felt like he was an expert in military strategy. Now, Powell had prefaced the presentation that Schwarzkopf wasn't satisfied with the plan as it was, and that it was designed to utilize the 200,000 soldiers presently in Saudi Arabia, rather than the 400,000 to 500,000 he preferred. However, Cheney and the Joint Chiefs felt that the plan didn't fully utilize the resources already available. He would give this operation to his Undersecretary Paul Wolfowitz to draft other options. A couple weeks later, Cheney would present his team's offensive plan, which involved deploying paratroopers to western Iraq to meet up with helicopter and tank brigades to take out missile launch sites, and then head east toward Baghdad. But this wasn't Cheney's only idea. He also asked Powell to explore nuclear options, which was given to a small team whose report said that it would take a considerable number of tactical nukes to make a difference on the battlefield. Powell showed the report to Secretary Cheney one time and then destroyed it. If I had any doubts before about the practicality of nukes on the field of battle, this report clinched them. Cheney would claim that he was just trying to get Schwarzkopf and Powell to think a little more creatively, but you never know with some of these guys. Up to this point, the president and NSC hadn't given Schwarzkopf the green light to plan an offensive based on what he believed would be necessary, rather than what had been made available. This was partly because the US hadn't received permission from the Saudis to station more than 200,000 troops yet. But more importantly, President Bush was still vacillating on whether he was willing to risk American lives in the name of Kuwait and international law. At the same time, however, he was also getting impatient for an excuse to attack Saddam. Had the Iraqis shot at coalition forces, they wouldn't need a UN resolution to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait or even to chase the Republican Guard back to Baghdad. The first of these concerns would be addressed by Central Command and the State Department. Not only did they need permission to station more troops in the country, but they also needed explicit permission to launch an offensive into Kuwait from Saudi territory. Schwarzkopf feared that popular support for Saddam in the Arab streets would deter Arab governments from granting permission for the attacks. James Baker would visit Saudi Arabia in late October, where he got reassurances from King Fahd that Saudi troops would stay the course if Saddam dragged Israel into the fight, along with agreeing to allow more US troops. It was at this point, most observers believe, Bush had made his decision. President Bush came to the conclusion, consciously or unconsciously, that he had to do whatever was necessary to liberate Kuwait, and the reality was that meant using force. He seemed no longer wrestling with the issue of sending American boys to be killed, that awful decision that only a president can make. Around the time of Baker's meeting with King Fahd, Colin Powell would visit Schwarzkopf in Saudi Arabia, where he gave him the news that the administration would now be giving him any and all resources he needed to succeed. If we go to war, we will not do it halfway. The United States military will give you whatever you need to do it right. We had learned a lesson in Panama. Go in big and end it quickly. We could not put the United States through another Vietnam. Powell's guarantee was a tad premature, but a week later, a meeting at the White House would approve the deployment of more troops and the drafting of offensive plans. The planned troop buildup would be announced after midterms, where the president had tried to keep the Gulf crisis a nonpartisan issue. General Schwarzkopf would go into full planning mode after receiving formal confirmation from Powell about the president's decision. His new battle plan had 5 goals: decapitate the leadership and command structure of Iraqi forces, establish air superiority, cut Iraqi supply lines, destroy chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons capability, and destroy the Republican Guard. I want you to destroy the Republican Guard. When you're done with them, I don't want them to be an effective fighting force anymore. I don't want them to exist as a military organization. We're not going into this with one arm tied behind our backs. We're not going to say we want to be as nice as we possibly can. And if they draw back across the border, that's fine with us. That's bullshit. We're going to destroy the Republican Guard. I wanted to make absolutely sure that if we took on Saddam, we would win not only on the battlefield, but in the history books, and that included Arab history books. Based on his equipment and personnel demands, Schwarzkopf estimated that the earliest he could be ready for a ground operation was early February. With the decision to expel Saddam by force made, the administration could now focus on building political support for the war. Of course, this was underway before the decision to invade was made. In mid-October, Cheney visited both London and Moscow to meet with Thatcher and Gorbachev. The former gave him advice on military strategy and maintaining public support based on her experience during the Falklands War. The latter gave him intelligence on specs of the weapons they had sold to Saddam. The trip also allowed Cheney to visit Soviet factories, whose manufacturing capacity, he noted, had drastically diminished. He would also prep the public for the possibility of war during TV interviews, saying that although it wasn't a foregone conclusion, it was very possible. President Bush and Prime Minister Thatcher continued their debate over whether to seek additional authorization from the UN. The Iraqis are clearly trying to avoid a provocation. My own view is increasingly that once we have the necessary forces in place, we should go sooner rather than later. Otherwise, we risk losing the support of Arab governments who will not understand delay and come to question our resolve. We shall also be confronted with further peace proposals, further incidents in the occupied territories, and growing strain on the coalition against Iraq. Saddam Hussein has got to lose and be seen to lose. We don't need more causes. Our embassies are there to protect our people. If we leave, aren't we deserting our people? But we need no more triggers for military action, and if you send helicopters in, they could be shot down. They are sitting ducks. Our embassy must close anyway. We can't service our people inside. We are ready for the air campaign. We don't have unlimited time. This appeals to us to act on a moral basis and to act together. Bush's primary concern was maintaining public support. By 1990, the general consensus on the American right was that Vietnam was a political defeat and not a military one. You could win every engagement on the battlefield, but if the voting public grows tired of the war, they will vote people into power who promise to end it. This is what the debates within the administration, as well as amongst coalition leaders, were about. Going to war with insufficient force could lead to a quagmire which could drag on the fighting and thus lead to losing public support. And so waiting until you have all of your ducks in a row and have the materials you need to actually win the fight quickly was essential. However, the longer it takes for you to get your ducks in a row also gives your enemy the possibility of getting their shit together as well, which could also prolong the fight and thus sap public will. And then there's the whole issue of how the fighting actually starts. If you attack the enemy without provocation, then the public is going to be less supportive of your actions. However, if you wait until provocation happens, then again, you give the enemy time to prepare, and when fighting eventually starts, it could take longer as well. President Bush wanted to maintain high public morale for the upcoming war, not just for the sake of this conflict, but for the sake of future conflicts. If the public gets war-weary, there might not be enough political support to engage in future fights when needed. There was also the problem of political expediency. Seeking UN authorization would certainly provide political cover for the US and other coalition members. I mean, you're not fighting for your own sake, you're fighting for the sake of international law and order. But this also creates future public expectations. I mean, you got support for the last war, why didn't you get international support for this war? And there are innumerable reasons as to why this might be the case. And here we see the biggest difference between the US and UK. President Bush was concerned with maintaining public support, while Thatcher was concerned with setting public expectations. President Bush, as the leader of the coalition, had to balance all of these concerns and interests, and would ultimately side with public and political support over expectations and prerogatives. And thus, President Bush would order Secretary of State James Baker to begin lobbying the governments of the Security Council members to support a resolution, and time the vote for when the U.S. held the rotating presidency of the Council. And the most frustrating member to deal with would be the Soviet Union, who was desperate to retain any semblance of superpower parity with the U.S. The Soviets were still holding up Yevgeny Primakov as the ideal man to negotiate with Saddam, but when he visited Baghdad in late October, Hussein threatened to attack Saudi oil fields if any attacks were launched at him. He also tried to tie his withdrawal from Kuwait to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict again, knowing the Soviets would be sympathetic to the case. Primakov would meet with both Bush and Thatcher after his meeting in Baghdad. He would tell President Bush about Saddam's demeanor, and how Hussein claimed that he would rather die than leave Kuwait. Primakov believed that Saddam's advisors were misleading him about the international situation, due to Saddam believing that most of the world had supported him, and that they were encouraging him to drag the Israelis into the conflict. However, at least according to Primakov, Saddam seemed to be aware that he had bitten off more than he could chew. "I'd die before leaving. I'm prepared to die, but this battle is not confined to one country alone. I am a realist. I know I must leave Kuwait, but I simply can't leave." Some of the sources I read for this video said that Saddam trying to tie his withdrawal from Kuwait to an Israeli withdrawal from the Palestinian territories was evidence that he was looking for a way out, but I'm not convinced. Saddam was a conspiracist and believed that the CIA and Mossad were all-knowing and all-powerful. He was also a raging anti-Semite who believed every stereotype about the Jews and believed Israel and the US were willing to use nuclear weapons on Iraq. Believing all these things about the Israelis would lead you to suspect that if this offer was sincerely made to the Israelis, that they probably would have rejected it. And if Saddam was making an offer to the Israelis that he knew they would reject, it kind of sounds like he probably wasn't serious about it. Instead, he was looking for an international justification for his occupation, letting him blame Israel for the invasion, which is consistent with his rhetoric about the Kuwaiti government. It seems most likely that this, as well as most of his other ploys, were all about buying time, dragging the process out long enough in the hopes that the West would lose interest. With this reality in mind, President Bush would send Secretary Baker out to secure the coalition's resolve, such as agreeing to reduce troop levels in the Gulf if Saddam voluntarily withdrew from Kuwait, as well as creating a claims tribunal at The Hague to resolve the border dispute between Iraq and Kuwait. Vice President Dan Quayle would also be enlisted to meet with coalition partners, with the French becoming a particular annoyance for him. The French couldn't seem to make up their minds. They were hoping they wouldn't have to participate, but if there was any action, they wanted to be a part of it. Similar to Middle Eastern leaders, Mitterrand was also upset with the US for having pulled out of Lebanon, due to France having been a major partner in the multinational force sent in during the Battle of Beirut. On top of that, the French public didn't support their government trying to restore the Kuwaiti monarchy and didn't like defending the House of Saud. I went to Saudi Arabia recently. In their palaces, one sees no women or ordinary people. It's not the kind of government I would like to send French soldiers to be killed for. A country could not commit itself to the principles of Kuwait. They cannot ask soldiers to die for the way the Kuwaitis have their type of government. How am I going to tell French farmers I've committed their sons' lives to retain a billionaire? Can we ensure the use of force is not just protecting the safety of banks in Switzerland? It's an idea that leaves me totally cold. The French weren't the only ones having trouble with the cultural and political realities of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's draconian social codes and morality police would rub U.S. forces the wrong way. The U.S. military had to ban alcohol and pornography on U.S. bases, as well as forbid mixed-sex gatherings off base. And the authorities received complaints about female soldiers removing their fatigues in public. At this early stage, morale among our troops was high, but the desert was a bleak, forbidding world, hedged in by Muslim moral strictures uncongenial to GIs from the Western world. And it wasn't just secular Western debauchery that got American commanders in hot water with Saudi officials. It was also just basic religious practices. So in the US, there are a number of religious nonprofits whose sole purpose is basically acquiring Bibles to give to soldiers who are enlisted. And you can consider in this conflict, when you have US soldiers stationed far away from home in a majority Muslim country, you can imagine that they were especially interested in getting these Bibles into the soldiers' hands. And this was a double problem for Saudi Arabia because, A, the importation of Bibles was illegal in Saudi Arabia, and this was the case because apostasy, as in converting from Islam to any other religion, is illegal and is punishable by death. Well, some of these religious nonprofits were also hoping to engage in a bit of covert missionary work in Saudi Arabia during the conflict. And so they would have to arrange a means of basically importing the Bibles into Saudi Arabia by skipping the ports and just flying them directly to U.S. military bases. The Arabs will take your sons, but not their Bibles? Colin, be reasonable. It will be reported on CNN. What will our people think? And so, although the Bible issue was eventually resolved, there was also the issue of chaplains being asked to not wear any kind of open signs of their non-Muslim religion in public, as well as worship services for non-Muslims not being allowed to be either recorded or publicized in any way. We all want the troops to have freedom of worship, but to do that we have to use a little judgment. You chaplains who are assigned to Riyadh and other cities already know how sensitive the local people are. The very sight of a cross is offensive to them. I'm asking those of you in the cities to take the Christian or Jewish insignia off your uniforms, or to wear them in such a way that they can't be seen. And the restrictions on Jewish soldiers were even harsher, with Jewish soldiers not even allowed to pray or hold worship services on Saudi soil, thus forcing the US to have to helicopter Jewish enlistees onto a nearby US ship in the Gulf to hold any kind of worship service. They can die defending your country, but they can't pray in it? And the more conservative elements of Saudi society would actively try to break up the relationship between the US military and Saudi Arabia. There was an incident where some bazaars in the cities were selling shirts that showed like a tank on top of a map of Saudi Arabia. And the kicker here is that the reason people are getting in trouble is because this map of Saudi Arabia on shirts showed the locations of Mecca and Medina, which can be found in any atlas around the world, but in Saudi Arabia at the time was apparently considered classified information, even though everyone knew exactly where they were. But the fact that they're considered classified information was also the justification for why atlases were banned in Saudi Arabia at the time. And Saudi officials initially blamed Americans for selling the shirts, but as it turns out, no, it wasn't them. It was Pakistani expats trying to sell these shirts to Americans. And so, as it turns out, some of the conservative political forces in Saudi Arabia had lied to the Saudi officials in order to try and get them to kick the American military out. But a more active part of the resistance to the American presence would be 33-year-old Osama Bin Laden. Bin Laden had spent much of the 80s helping funnel money and arms to various Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan fighting the Soviets. after which he began aiding jihadists in Yemen. Osama bin Laden allegedly sent a letter to King Fahd offering to recruit a ragtag team of Muslim fighters to resist an Iraqi invasion in place of US and coalition forces. The closest he got, according to his own testimony, were a couple deputy ministers. I directed my advice straight to the Deputy Minister of Defense, informing him of the great sins from which the state should desist, and of the danger of persisting with them, but to no avail. Then I met the Deputy Director of the Ministry for Security Affairs, who strongly reproached me for advising the Deputy Minister of Defense, and began haranguing me about exactly the same sins that I mentioned to the minister. And when these direct appeals didn't work, Osama bin Laden began fear-mongering to local religious leaders, telling them about how the secular Westerners were going to corrupt the moral Saudi society, which Saddam had actually been making these same points to foreign religious leaders as well. Back in London, Thatcher's government was drawing up their own list of policy goals, more or less in line with the US, but with an extra emphasis on the destruction of Iraqi WMDs and the creation of a regional security alliance against Iraq. But like the US government, she was also politically preparing the British public for war. There is never any lack of people anxious to avoid the use of force, no matter how little chance there is of negotiation succeeding, and no matter how many difficulties are created for the troops who are trying to prepare themselves for war, the case is always made for yet another piece of last-ditch diplomacy. By early November, the Bush administration had decided to seek a UN resolution authorizing force to expel Saddam after Baker's meeting with coalition leaders. And although he was committed to using arms, President Bush feared setting a specific deadline for withdrawal. Doing so publicly would not only commit the coalition to military action and give Saddam a chance to bolster his forces, but also make it more likely Saddam might agree to some peaceful solution that would let him preserve his military strength, leaving him able to threaten his neighbors again. And although they had sufficient air power to achieve the destruction of strategic Iraqi infrastructure, their ground forces wouldn't be ready until February. And when the president asked the NSC what they should do if Iraq attacked Israel before their full force arrived, National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft suggested they attack Kuwait early. The Soviets continued to slow-walk the coalition's efforts. The Bush administration wanted to pass a Security Council resolution that demanded Iraq withdraw from Kuwait by a certain date, and if it didn't, the coalition was given the authority to expel them by force. Gorbachev tried to get Bush to split the resolution in two, first passing the deadline resolution and then passing the authorization of force, but Bush believed that it would take too long to pass the second resolution and give Saddam the opportunity to stall the process. The Soviets weren't the only hesitant coalition partners. Aside from France, Chancellor Helmut Kohl was also worried that a war in the Middle East might harm him in the federal elections in December, the first held since formal reunification in October that year. But Thatcher was also dealing with political problems at home, with an internal challenge to her leadership of the Conservative Party, and despite this, she was still in full support of the war. Another potential wrinkle was China, who along with the Soviets had a history of shenanigans in the UN. The Chinese were apprehensive about supporting military actions, believing it would alter the balance of power in the Gulf. When China's foreign minister, Chiang Kai-shek, told this to James Baker while in Cairo, Baker retorted that the balance of power had already been altered by Saddam. Neither President Bush nor Secretary Baker had visited China since the administration was sworn in, which Beijing had been requesting. But there was still substantial political pressure at home for the administration to distance itself from China after the Tiananmen Square massacre. In exchange for a visit from Baker in 1991, Kai-shek offered to not veto the Security Council resolution. After his visit to Egypt, Baker would meet with Al-Zal in Turkey, and then with Eduard Shevardnadze in Moscow. The Soviets had been hoping to let sanctions work, but Baker explains to them that the sanctions weren't going to. Tightening the sanctions isn't the problem. This guy will let everybody in the country starve before he'll give this up. The only thing that's critical then is that you're going to use force. You have to know that you will succeed. We learned from Afghanistan, don't listen to the military men who give you these simplistic views that you will succeed. You need to know that you'll succeed. Are you really sure you've thought this through? You understand now that if we pass a resolution authorizing the use of force, and if Saddam does not move, you will actually have to use force. If you do it, you have to use it. Are you really ready to do that right now? Baker's tour of Coalition and Security Council countries continued with meeting the Canadian Foreign Minister in Bermuda, followed by meetings in Geneva with the foreign ministers of the Ivory Coast, Ethiopia, and Zaire, who all supported the proposed resolution. As the possibility of direct clashes with the coalition grew, Saddam would try to break up the alliance by releasing hostages from key countries, in hopes that they could scuttle the resolution vote at the UN. World leaders gathered in France for the signing of the Paris Charter, which gave coalition leaders a chance to discuss further plans for the Gulf. One standout moment made in light of recent events was the speech by President Václav Havel of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia has made it clear on a number of occasions that it is necessary to resist evil, that it is necessary to resist aggression, because our own history has taught us ample lessons about the consequences of appeasement. After the Paris Summit, James Baker would visit Yemen, whose UN ambassador was trying to get a resolution passed calling for UN monitors to be placed in the West Bank and Gaza. The US was already pressuring Israel to stay out of the conflict with Iraq, and thus would have to veto the resolution if put to a vote. But Baker feared doing so would anger the Arab members of the coalition and threatened to fracture it, so he began to pressure President Saleh. Baker pointed out that the US hadn't placed the newly unified Yemen on its state sponsor of terror list, despite South Yemen having been on it, in addition to the $70 million in annual foreign aid. Despite this, Saleh publicly said Yemen would vote no on the upcoming Security Council resolution. Baker would then meet with Abu Hassan, the foreign minister of Malaysia, at the Los Angeles International Airport. He was not happy having to take a 30-hour flight just because Baker wanted to avoid having to visit China. He would repeat some of Saddam's propaganda, asserting that the Israelis were the real criminals and that they should be prioritized over any actions against Saddam, and thus refused to make any commitments about his vote. In a meeting at the Paris Summit, Gorbachev told Bush that he would vote in favor of the force authorization resolution, but that he couldn't announce so publicly prior to it. The USSR still had a large Muslim population who were very supportive of Saddam and saw the Gulf crisis as the Western world ganging up on a Muslim country. But while world leaders were discussing the future of Europe and the Middle East, there was diplomatic subterfuge afoot. On November 19th, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney received a letter from former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, lobbying him to vote against the Bush administration's Security Council resolution. Jimmy Carter had sent letters to the ambassadors of all UN Security Council members except the U.S., hoping to persuade them to vote against the resolution authorizing force to expel Saddam. It was an unbelievable letter, asking the other members of the council to vote against his own country. Carter later acknowledged that he had sent the letter, but he claimed that he had told President Bush what he was doing. It seemed to me that if there was ever a violation of the Logan Act prohibiting diplomacy by private citizens, this was it. President Bush was furious. Although he was never punished for this, it's very likely that Jimmy Carter was, in fact, in violation of the Logan Act, which is a law forbidding unauthorized American citizens from negotiating with foreign governments. What's funny is that this wouldn't even be the last time Jimmy Carter violated the Logan Act, doing so again in 2008 when he opened up negotiations with Hezbollah against the explicit requests of the Bush administration. And so if I had a nickel for every time Jimmy Carter violated the Logan Act, I would have 2 nickels.
Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice, right?
The day before the resolution vote, Baker would secretly meet with the foreign minister of Cuba at the Waldorf Astoria, who had favored letting sanctions play out, and told him Cuba would vote no. And in one last meeting with the Chinese foreign minister, Chiang couldn't promise more than an abstention. Totalitarian regimes never seem to think that their internal policies, no matter how repressive, should be of any consequence in bilateral relations. The vote was held on November 29th. The debate saw Muslim-majority countries emphasize the need for more diplomacy in the period before any deadline. In the process of securing support of the Soviets and the cooperation of China, the resolution didn't explicitly call for armed force, but rather approved all means necessary, which provided Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping the political fig leaf they needed. It did not matter. A bullet fired through a euphemism is still a bullet. The final draft of the resolution gave Saddam until January 15, 1991, to pull his forces out of Kuwait. Otherwise, the coalition was given the authority to use all means necessary to expel them. The final vote saw 12 voting in favor, with both Cuba and Yemen voting against and China abstaining. The countdown to Desert Storm had begun. Although President Bush had successfully convinced the international community of the necessity of force, he still had to convince the American people. Although the living memory of Vietnam was beginning to fade, the political memory was still alive, and every new conflict was forecast as a new Vietnam. These fears had prevented President Carter from more aggressive tactics to rescue Americans taken hostage during the Iranian Revolution, as well as forcing President Reagan to pull the Marines out of Beirut, allowing Syria to take control, and killing the nascent peace deal between Lebanon and Israel. However, both the Reagan and Bush administrations had begun to rebuild public trust in the capabilities of the American military through smaller interventions, such as the 1983 invasion of Grenada, the bombings of Libya in 1986, and the invasion of Panama in 1989. The keys were maintaining public support and not prolonging the conflict. The president would help maintain public support by not making the Gulf crisis into a partisan issue. Despite this, a document signed by 81 Democrats in late October 1990 was sent to the president, asserting that a conflict with Iraq would result in at least 10,000 casualties, and opposed any offensive military action without both UN and congressional authorization, despite the administration insisting it didn't require authorization from either. Although we did explore options for the involvement of Congress, we never seriously contemplated invoking the War Powers Resolution. To minimize the potential political fallout from the decision, he decided not to announce the buildup until after the 1990 midterms. However, he announced it before giving Congress prior notice. I can't believe we're going to do this without them knowing anything. They have no idea we're preparing for war. These guys will go crazy. You're going to have a load of crap on your hands when you get back. Regardless, this would spark domestic partisan opposition to reaching UN authorization. New York Senator Patrick Moynihan, who was rumored to be eyeing a run for president in 1992, began speaking out against the buildup of troops. In TV interviews, he would say that the leadership of Kuwait didn't deserve liberation, and in a letter to the president said that Kuwait's existence was an accident of history.
We'll lose. I mean, we will lose one way or the other. We will leave the Gulf in ruins, and we will have destroyed yet another presidency in the process.
Another presidential hopeful, Georgia Senator Sam Nunn, would begin holding hearings in the Armed Services Committee, where most of his invited guests would speak against the war.
The question is, I view it as not whether military action is justified. I believe it is. The question is whether military action is wise at this time and in our own national interest.
Today's witness, former Defense Secretary James Schlesinger, said he thinks sanctions could work against Iraq, but it would take a year. The White House is refusing to let any current cabinet officers testify until after the United Nations vote later this week. Senators complain bitterly that getting a UN resolution authorizing use of force against Iraq is not a substitute for getting a declaration of war from the U.S. Congress.
Speaker of the House Tom Foley would tell the administration that they should wait at least a year for sanctions to work before considering military action, and that Congress had only been as cooperative as it had been because the administration had sought sanctions through the UN first. But many in the White House feared that the mere existence of sanctions were being used to obfuscate the need for military action. Unfortunately, the resolution gave some in Congress an opportunity to indulge in their well-known proclivity for wanting everything both ways. They could continue to denounce Iraq's aggression while using the resolution as cover to avoid coming to grips with the central policy dilemma. What should be done if the sanctions didn't work? The sanctions resolution gave many members an ideal excuse to avoid the hard choices. President Bush would tell congressional leadership that the sanctions weren't going to work, pointing to Saddam's growing military footprint in Kuwait. To appease congressional complaints, National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft would meet with Democratic leadership and keep them up to date on the events going on the ground, and would convince them that the administration had not yet given up on diplomacy, especially when President Bush announced an offer to meet with Tariq Aziz in D.C. During these interbranch talks, the Democrats would reiterate their opposition to military force, while the administration would tell them that the longer they waited to use force, the harsher that eventual use of force would have to be. Additionally, they told the congressmen that their various individual statements to the press about opposing the campaign emboldened Saddam, making it appear that the U.S. wasn't unified in their effort, and thus only had to wait out the coalition before their respective publics grew tired. Since convincing congressional Democrats was proving difficult, the administration would need to go directly to the American people. We were also running into increasing difficulty in making our point understood about what was at stake. We had failed to explain why our troops were in the Saudi desert, why the United States had to lead the response to Iraq's aggression. Too much of the reasoning, they argued, seemed abstract. In retrospect, I think our deepening involvement in the Gulf crisis was an important factor in the rise of resistance to our response. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney would constantly compare the conflict to World War II when speaking with the press, pointing out that prior to Pearl Harbor, the congressional vote to extend the draft was only approved by one vote. Secretary of State James Baker would begin telling audiences about the economic consequences of Iraq controlling Kuwaiti oil, such as the rise in gas prices and the downstream impact on jobs. He had hoped that this appeal to personal economic concerns would resonate with people during a time of recession. Unfortunately, the media just used this argument as an excuse to say that this was a war for oil. Congressional Republicans would also make the case to the public, with Kansas Senator Bob Dole expressing similar concerns over oil prices. Indiana Senator Dick Lugar would also speak up in favor of the war, suggesting the president call a lame duck session of Congress to pass a resolution authorizing military action. The administration would decline this suggestion, fearing they didn't have the votes to pass it, and how a failed vote would embolden Saddam and weaken the coalition's resolve. One of the strongest talking points the administration had was the ongoing hostage crisis, with the Ba'athist regime having forbidden foreigners from leaving the country, while taking the citizens of the coalition countries captive, and housing them at strategic locations around Baghdad as human shields. When the administration would condemn this action, many in the press and media would accuse the White House of exaggerating the situation to build support for the war. But as the Gulf crisis went on, Saddam would begin using these hostages as bargaining chips to break up the coalition. He would strategically release hostages to either improve his public image or hopefully to secure a separate deal with individual coalition members. Saddam came to believe that most of these countries were involved for purely self-interested reasons, and thus if he released their hostages, they would have no reason to station troops or maintain the sanctions against him. The weakest links in the coalition chain were France and the Soviet Union, each having their own domestic political reasons for not wanting armed intervention. French President François Mitterrand had granted some legitimacy to the invasion back in September by neglecting to call for restoration of the Kuwaiti monarchy at a UN meeting. Saddam would release all French hostages in November, timed for when Secretary Baker was visiting Paris, hoping it would weaken French resolve, and led many to suspect that the French had made a secret deal with the Iraqis. This was not unprecedented, as the French had made many deals with the Iranians to get hostages released throughout the 1980s. Of course, most Western governments had similar policies, though most not as overt as France. Most coalition governments wouldn't be directly involved in getting their hostages released, but they would allow private actors to go to Baghdad and free them. Former German Chancellor Willy Brandt, along with former UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim, would get Saddam to release German and Austrian hostages. Jesse Jackson, who had helped arrange the release of hostages held in Lebanon back in the 1980s, would meet with Saddam and get him to release a number of American hostages. And a similar incident happened with Muhammad Ali as well. Now, Saddam loved these meetings. They got him a chance to have photo ops with global celebrities and let him pretend that he was being a humanitarian. And although the Bush administration didn't like giving Saddam these propaganda victories, they ultimately weighed them out to realize that they were more beneficial than detrimental, because they got American citizens out of harm's way so that Saddam couldn't use them as human shields when a fighting eventually broke out. Former UK Prime Minister Edward Heath would also enact his own mission to get elderly and sick British citizens evacuated from Iraq. Initially, the Foreign Ministry had reached out to Heath to visit Baghdad, but when Margaret Thatcher discovered this, she was extremely upset and had the mission cancelled. This was partly to avoid accusations of appeasement after she had made such a big deal about avoiding appeasement like in the past, but it was also personal. In a story that's better left for another time, Edward Heath had been a thorn in Margaret Thatcher's side since 1975, when she wrested leadership of the Conservative Party from Heath after their defeat in the 1974 general election. Since that point, he had become a vocal critic of Thatcher's leadership of both the party and the country. There was simply no comparison between Saddam Hussein before the Gulf War and Hitler. Negotiation is not appeasement. Appeasement involves a sacrifice of moral principle in order to avert aggression. Negotiation requires some change of the status quo in order to make progress. This is the very stuff of diplomacy. And so she was not too enthused that her foreign minister had reached out to him of all people to speak with Saddam. Regardless, Heath would go ahead with the mission, though with indirect support from the government. And just to irk her some more, he announced his trip to Baghdad at the Conservative Party conference in October 1990. Working with Richard Branson, Heath managed to get all of the infirm British citizens being held in Baghdad out in late October. The Soviets were the most direct in negotiating with the Iraqis, arranging the release of all Soviet technicians who had been operating much of Iraqi's military and manufacturing systems. In mid-November, Saddam announced that he would begin gradually releasing all the hostages over a 3-month period, beginning on Christmas Day, in what the U.S. State Department saw as an attempt to drag out the crisis into Ramadan, when there would be a lot of Muslims traveling for the Hajj. President Bush, with a group of representatives from Congress, would meet with the Emir of Kuwait and King Fahd in late November, who reassured them that fighting wars during Ramadan was not at all unusual in Islamic history, citing both the Six-Day and Yom Kippur Wars as recent examples. Despite the hostage crisis and opposition from the U.S. Congress, the Bush administration was able to get the UN Security Council to approve a resolution authorizing force to expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. Saddam had tried to get Gorbachev to break rank by releasing the remaining Soviet hostages on November 28th, but when the vote came the next day, he refused to veto it. Saddam would then announce plans to release all hostages on December 6th. Despite this, the planning for Desert Storm continued. Schwarzkopf's plan involved 2 divisions of Marines and 1 Saudi attacking near the Gulf to surround Kuwait City, while a pan-Arab force consisting of Saudis and Egyptians would invade from the west to capture road junctions northeast of Kuwait, capture Iraqi supply lines, and eventually entering the city to fight the Iraqis directly. Another U.S. force would move along the Saudi-Iraq border to block the escape of the Republican Guard, and then join the rest of the forces in Kuwait to crush the regular army. Another force would move in to destroy the Republican Guard, and, if necessary, move on Baghdad. When meeting with President Bush during his Thanksgiving visit to the troops, Schwarzkopf said, "The best case would be about 3 days, which assumes that the Iraqis quickly fold and surrender en masse. The worst would be a situation in which we fight to a stalemate. That could go on for months." To demonstrate to the democratically controlled Congress that he had not given up on diplomacy, President Bush would invite Tariq Aziz to meet in Washington on December 10th, which would be followed by a visit from Baker to Baghdad after December 15th. The offer was also about giving Gorbachev cover within his own government, proving to the Soviet hardliners that he wasn't joining the West and kicking one of their clients. However, this offer would upset other coalition members who felt like they had taken political risks to vote for intervention just to see the U.S. offer negotiations instead. President Bush hadn't informed his allies about this invitation beforehand, which led the Kuwaitis and Saudis to fear that he would allow Saddam to peacefully withdraw his army intact. Saddam responded to the invitation on December 3rd, but as the hostages began to be released on the 6th, he began demanding the talks be expanded into a general Middle East peace conference, including resolutions for Lebanon, Syria, and the Palestinian territories. The administration rejected the general conference idea, but agreed to a meeting between Bush and Aziz on December 17th. But that the meeting between Baker and Saddam occur no later than January 3rd, fearing that Saddam would use a later date to delay military intervention. Out of frustration of Saddam trying to delay the meeting with Baker, Bush canceled the meeting on December 14th, which saw Saddam cancel the meeting between Bush and Aziz. While the administration haggled with Baghdad over a date for their bilateral meetings, President Bush would meet with Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir on December 11th, asking him to keep Israel out of the conflict in the Gulf. Back in August, Bush had approved a CIA mission to set up and aid resistance movements in Iraq in hopes that they could topple Saddam, and they relied on the Mossad, who had more direct intelligence lines into the Iraqi regime. In November, the Mossad received intelligence from Iranian sources, detailing an Iraqi plan to deliver chemical and biological weapons via Soviet-built Scud missiles. Fearing this might be disinformation to get Israel to attack Iraq, the Mossad would send an agent into Western Iraq via a spy helicopter, where they discover a mobile Scud launcher. Given this information, Shamir wanted to trade his compliance for U.S. intelligence. Now, the Iraqis had indeed been preparing to use chemical and biological weapons against the Israelis. Months before they invaded Kuwait, Iraqi engineers had been testing the firing distances of their Scud missiles, as well as ways to deploy chemical and germ weapons. Firing within Iraqi borders, they discovered that the missiles could easily reach Israel, but the chemical and biological payloads would be evaporated by the flames when the missile hit its target, making them ineffective as WMDs, and the Iranians had probably obtained these details during the early weeks of the crisis. Prior to the invasion itself, Saddam had secretly sent a message to the Iranian president Hashemi Rafsanjani, where he offered to recognize the 1975 border in favor of Iran, given Tehran's cooperation in letting Saddam invade Kuwait and possibly Saudi Arabia and the UAE as well. Additionally, Saddam would send a sizable portion of his air force to Iran for safekeeping, hoping to bring them back to Iraq after the war. But as signs showed that Iraq was clearly outclassed, the Iranians would simply appropriate the aircraft for themselves, repainting them to their own military colors. The difficulties of negotiating with the Iraqis and Israelis were compounded by the continued domestic opposition to the war in the U.S. The president's invitation to negotiate with Iraq had done some work in convincing the public of his willingness to continue using diplomacy. Senate Republicans encouraged the president to call an emergency session to vote on a resolution, hoping to force the Democrats to publicly vote against the president, but the Democratic majorities weren't willing to call a vote. Vice President Dan Quayle would be sent on a tour of college campuses where he would be protested by students and be asked loaded hypothetical questions by journalists, with CBS's Mike Wallace asking him why the CIA didn't just assassinate Saddam. Are you serious? For one thing, it's illegal, in part because of the way CBS used to take such pride in blowing the whistle on covert operations. While the administration was trying to build public support for the war, internally they still debated whether or not they actually needed congressional authorization to engage in a fight, considering that the United States was subject to the treaty that authorized the use of force in the first place. I also thought it would set a dangerous precedent. As a legal and constitutional matter, the president had the authority he needed. If he sought congressional approval, that would surely be read by some as a message that he needed the congressional vote. It looked to me like a move that would diminish the power of the office. But there would be a persistent media opposition to the war effort. They criticized the decision to send troops to Saudi Arabia and questioned whether the U.S. needed to lead this effort. One moment they would criticize the administration for not giving a reason why ordinary Americans should care about what happens in the Gulf, and then claim they were trading blood for oil when officials brought up how Saddam's invasion impacted oil prices. They would also criticize Germany and Japan for not contributing enough to the coalition due to the Middle East oil mostly going to the European and Asian markets. This actually allowed the administration to pressure Chancellor Helmut Kohl and Prime Ministers Kaifu into providing more financial assistance. But most harmful to the war effort, from the administration's perspective, were the casualty forecasts. Robert Novak predicted there would be at least 20,000 casualties. Former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, who led the Pentagon during much of the Vietnam War, predicted there would be at least 30,000 casualties, while former Senator George McGovern claimed that there would be over 50,000. In contrast, the Department of Defense calculated it would be under 2,000. In addition to coalition casualties, some predicted Arab casualties as well, with West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd predicting they would be so high as to permanently hamper U.S.-Arab relations. This went along with most congressional Democrats opposing intervention under any circumstances, always insisting that this would be another Vietnam. The House Majority Leader, Dick Gephardt of Missouri, threatened to cut off funding if the president invaded Kuwait without a declaration of war from Congress. And debate only grew hotter when the new Congress was sworn in.
Today is a tragic day for humanity, for the people of Iraq, for the people of the United States, and for the United Nations as an institution. It is also a tragic day for the future of our planet and for the children, 30,000 of whom in the Third World will starve to death today while we spend billions to wage this war, and 25% of whom live in poverty in our own country because we apparently lack the funds to provide them a minimal standard of living. Mr. Speaker, despite the fact that virtually the entire world has been united against Saddam Hussein, a two-bit vicious dictator who illegally and brutally invaded Kuwait, the President concluded that there was no way of resolving this conflict and achieving our goals other than waging a massive war, perhaps unprecedented in the history of the world in terms of the death and destruction wrought in its first day as a result of our aerial attacks.
Some of these new congressmen tried to push through a resolution explicitly forbidding any action by U.S. troops without congressional authorization. Senator Sam Nunn was still advocating for sanctions to play out, in spite of polls from ABC showing broad public support for military action. Vice President Quayle and Chief of Staff John Sununu would lobby moderate Democrats in the Senate such as Joe Lieberman of Connecticut, Chuck Robb of Virginia, and both Harry Reid and Dick Bryan of Nevada to support a resolution authorizing force, in opposition to congressional Democratic leadership. The wins in Congress would shift slightly on January 3rd, when President Bush announced one last chance for Iraqi officials to meet with Secretary Baker in Geneva. Saddam, believing the coalition was on the verge of collapse, accepted the offer and agreed to a meeting between Baker and Aziz on the night, only 6 days before the UN deadline. There were those who had reservations about the meeting. Brent Scowcroft feared that Saddam might agree to a withdrawal on U.S. terms, but then stall or slow walk the process, or even pull his army just outside the border and wait until coalition forces were withdrawn from the peninsula. James Baker would prepare for the meeting with Aziz by speaking with Ambassador April Glaspie. She recounts an event where Saddam invited a bunch of diplomats to view the construction of a dam in northern Iraq. The dam was being constructed by workers from Vietnam, whom Saddam would denigrate as being subhuman, and then said, and these were the people who beat the Americans. President Bush would give Baker a handwritten letter for Aziz to deliver to Saddam, with a printed copy for Aziz himself. Baker would travel to Geneva with General Graves, who was tasked with explaining to the Iraqis the broad outline of Desert Shield and the level of destruction the coalition was ready and willing to employ. Tariq Aziz was accompanied by Saddam's half-brother, Barzan al-Takriti. Baker handed the 2 copies of Bush's letter to Aziz, who opened and read the copy. Aziz would go on to give a diatribe about the historical relations between the West and Arab states, and accuse the U.S. of holding a double standard between Iraq and Israel. He reiterated Saddam's conspiracy that the U.S., Israel, and Kuwait were trying to destroy Iraq, which made the invasion a defensive act done on behalf of the Palestinians, which Baker knew was bullshit. It was essential that Iraq's leadership understood that Iraq would not be allowed to fight a war of attrition. Our forces, not theirs, would define the terms of this engagement. Aziz would also try to drag out the negotiations by offering Baker a chance to speak with Saddam in Baghdad, but Baker refused to meet with Saddam while Iraqi troops were still in Kuwait. Our objectives is for you to leave Kuwait. That's the only solution we'll accept, and if you will not do that, then we'll find ourselves at war. And if you do go to war with the coalition, you will surely lose. This will not be a war of attrition like you fought with Iran. It will be fought using the means and weapons that play to our strengths, not to yours. We have the means to define how the battle will be fought, and you do not. We owe it to you to tell you that there will be no stalemate, no UN ceasefire or breathing space for negotiation. If conflict begins, it will be massive. This will not be another Vietnam. Should war begin, God forbid, it will be fought to a swift, decisive conclusion. If the conflict involves your use of chemical weapons against our forces, the American people will demand vengeance. We have the means to exact it. With regards to this part of my presentation, this is not a threat, it is a promise. If there is any use of weapons like that, our objective won't just be the liberation of Kuwait, but the elimination of the current Iraqi regime. And anyone responsible for using those weapons would be held accountable. There have been other leaders who have miscalculated the readiness of the American democracy to fight and have paid the ultimate price. Do not repeat their mistake. Don't misinterpret the different voices you hear from American society. We have the strongest system of government in the world. America will unite to fight a war if you give us no other choice. And after bearing all of that, Aziz had his own words for Baker. I have no illusions about the cost of war. My youngest son is 11. All he has seen in his life is war, air raids, and Iranian missiles. War is not a strange thing. So we know these facts, and we know your determination that war will be destructive, despite the fact that part of your statement contained some insults. The present leadership will continue to lead Iraq now and in the future. Those who will disappear are not Iraq, but some of your friends in the region. Iraq as a nation is 6,000 years old, and it has witnessed successive kingdoms, empires, and civilizations. We have outlasted coalitions like yours in the past, and we will last longer than your coalition. We are not afraid of being attacked by a superior force. Our people not only support us, but they love us. Our population of 19 million is convinced that once war breaks out between us, we will be victorious. I hope you won't miscalculate our capability to endure the cost of war.
I've spoken with the Secretary of State, Jim Baker, who reported to me on his nearly 7 hours of conversation with the Iraqi Foreign Minister, Tariq Aziz. Secretary Baker made it clear that he discerned no evidence whatsoever that Iraq was willing to comply with the international community's demand to withdraw from Kuwait and comply with the United Nations resolutions. Secretary Baker also reported to me that the Iraqi foreign minister rejected my letter to Saddam Hussein, refused to carry this letter and give it to the president of Iraq.
After Aziz and Barzani left the meeting, Baker's team picked up the uncollected letter and would publish it. I write this letter not to threaten but to inform. I do so with no sense of satisfaction, for the people of the United States have no quarrel with the people of Iraq. Mr. President, UN Security Council Resolution 678 establishes the period before January 15th of this year as a pause of goodwill, so that the crisis may end without further violence. Whether this pause is used as intended or merely becomes a prelude to further violence is in your hands and yours alone. I hope you weigh your choices carefully and choose wisely, for much will depend on it. Unless you withdraw from Kuwait completely and without condition, you will lose more than Kuwait. What is at issue here is not just the future of Kuwait, but rather the future of Iraq. The choice is yours to make. With Iraq's rejection of Resolution 678, the U.S. Congress would finally debate military action. They first voted on the resolution by Senator Nunn, which explicitly forbade any military intervention without a congressional declaration of war, which was rejected 46-53. And after rejecting a second Democratic resolution came the bipartisan resolution by Senators John Warner of Virginia and Bob Dole of Kansas. On January 12, 1991, the House would vote in favor of the bipartisan resolution, 250 to 183, with the Senate passing it 52-47, which involved 10 Democrats joining with 42 Republican senators, with 2 Republican senators voting against. After over 4 months, all the legal and political hurdles had been jumped, and with only 3 days left before the deadline, the world sat in anticipation.
First, let me just say that I am gratified by the vote in the Congress supporting the United Nations Security Council resolution. This action by the Congress unmistakably demonstrates the United States' commitment to the international demand for a complete and unconditional withdrawal of Iraq from Kuwait. This clear expression of the Congress represents the last best chance for peace. As a democracy, we've debated this issue openly and in good faith. And as President, I have held extensive consultation with the Congress. We've now closed ranks behind a clear signal of our determination and our resolve to implement the United Nations resolutions. Those who may have mistaken our democratic process as a sign of weakness now see the strength of democracy.
I felt the heavy weight that I might be faced with impeachment lifted from my shoulders as I heard the results. In truth, even had Congress not passed the resolutions, I would have acted and ordered our troops into combat. I know it would have caused an outcry, but it was the right thing to do. After the Geneva meeting, Secretary Baker made one last attempt at reaching Saddam by reading a statement live on CNN, which Saddam was known to watch religiously. Time is running out, but the path to peace remains open. There is still time for Iraq to walk that path. They can still choose peace and avert disaster, but the choice is theirs and theirs alone. But even as we hope and pray and we work for peace, America and all of the other nations and the international coalition must be prepared for a conflict we do not seek, but from which we shall not shrink. As the clock ticks down to midnight, January 15th, I cannot give you an absolute definitive answer, but I can tell you this. You will not have to wait much longer for an answer to that question. Baker would spend the last few days before the deadline shoring up support from the coalition partners. The French refused to have their aircraft participate in the bombing of Iraq, and even tried to get President Bush to agree to a Middle Eastern peace conference if Saddam pulled out, which was rejected. Saddam had been sending out secret feelers to the Saudis while Baker asked King Fahd to get Syria to commit his troops to the liberation of Kuwait City, along with getting Germany and the UAE to contribute more funds as well. The Yemeni government was secretly trying to get Iraq to pull out before it was too late, while Assad made a public appeal to Saddam to withdraw. Back in the Pentagon, they debated how open they should be with the media and whether or not on-the-ground reporters should be stationed with ground forces. For the most part, there hadn't been much on-the-ground reporting during Desert Shield because the Saudi government refused to grant visas to journalists. But this resulted in most of the reporting happening with journalists stationed in Iraq, who were subject to Saddam's censors and propaganda, which eventually led to King Fahd loosening the restrictions. There was also an underlying sense of distrust between the U.S. military and the media, with the military fearing unfair reporting by journalists and the media believing the military was lying to them, both holdovers from Vietnam. Both Powell and Schwarzkopf and many other senior officials had developed a deep distrust of the press based on their experiences in Vietnam. It was understandable, and I did not want to add to the already considerable pressure Schwarzkopf was under. No matter what the Pentagon does with the press during a time of war, the U.S. government is likely to be criticized for it. If they embed reporters and they give them access to lots of information, the military is accused of trying to shape the truth or to sugarcoat things. If reporters don't get access, then the military is accused of trying to hide the truth. In some sense, it's a no-win situation, but I think, all in all, we handled it pretty well. While the coalition was getting its final preparations in order, the Israelis were still nervously waiting on the sidelines, hearing increasingly hostile rhetoric from Baghdad. The Bush administration tried to reassure the Israelis that they would protect them from Iraq's WMDs, but it's reasonable that a country founded to ensure another Holocaust wouldn't happen was hesitant to not act against a regime that was promising to carry one out. If he attacks you, or if an attack becomes apparent, we had the capacity to obliterate his military structure. A preemptive strike by Israel would be very bad. I know your position about responding to an attack and I respect it, but if we could consult first, our preferences would be for Israel to not respond until you have seen our reply. We have common objectives and I would like to fulfill them. I am encouraged by your words, but we will be obliged to defend ourselves and prevent continuation of such attacks. You say you will obliterate their capability, but you may miss some. On top of the gas masks they had been procuring since October, the Israeli government had also been amassing a stockpile of extra beds and testing equipment outside hospitals in order to deal with a potential wave of chemical attack victims, with extra staff recruited to triage patients. American Jewish businessman Sim Daniel Abraham would donate $1.5 million to the Israeli Ministry of Health to buy ventilators. Another American Jewish businessman, Pincus Green, was wanted for tax evasion in the U.S., and prior to the war had made his way to Israel, and in a meeting with the Israeli Minister of Health, Ehud Olmert, promised to anonymously donate several $1 million to the ministry if Olmert didn't tell anybody he was in the country. Given the potentially apocalyptic situation Israel was in, Olmert accepted the offer. However, this created an accounting issue with the ministry's comptroller, who eventually got Olmert to give Green's name, which would be published in a later report. Despite the Americans asking them not to retaliate against an attack by Saddam for months, the Israelis would work on their own contingency plans. A British-born Israeli, Ephraim Halevi, would arrange a meeting between King Hussein and Yitzhak Shamir in the UK on January 5th. The Iraqis had been flying reconnaissance flights over Jordan, and the Israelis feared having to fight the Jordanians to take out an Iraqi plane headed for Israel. After an hour of discussion, King Hussein gave Shamir permission to fire missiles at incoming Iraqi aircraft over Jordanian airspace. But the Americans were not told about these discussions, and so when the Israelis would ask them to provide information on the location of Scud sites, the Americans refused to give it, fearing it would drag Jordan into the conflict. However, these permissions from the Jordanians didn't completely reassure the Israelis about an attack from Saddam because, ultimately, ballistic missiles were less accurate than planes. So Defense Minister Moshe Arens called Secretary Cheney about the Geneva meeting, believing an Iraqi attack was imminent. Cheney would try to reassure Arens by offering to send Paul Wolfowitz and Larry Eagleburger to Jerusalem with a battery of Patriot missiles and servicemen to operate them. Of course, while the coalition and the Israelis were busy preparing themselves for what Saddam was calling the mother of all battles, the Iraqis were making their own preparations. Although the sanctions hadn't deterred the regime from its actions, it was having an effect on the people of Iraq. Saddam issued decrees against food hoarding, punishable by death, in spite of also ordering the population to stock up on food and medicine. They were also told to black out their windows and empty their basements to be used as bomb shelters. He called Army reservists into service, while his propaganda machine was busy pumping out material portraying him as a heroic champion standing up to foreign tyrants. He began coup-proofing his regime by replacing high-ranking officials with family members and close confidants. The regime continued looting Kuwait of most of its movable riches, and enforcing their weird brand of secular Islamism, simultaneously criticizing the Gulf states of anti-Islamic moral corruption, all the while forcing Ba'athist secularism on the people of Kuwait. In early January, Saddam met with his cousin, Hassan al-Majid, who was in charge of Iraq's WMD program, wanting to make sure that they were available to Iraqi forces if needed. However, Hassan had to explain that the chemical weapons were ready to deploy, but not the biological or nuclear ones. Since mid-1990, before the invasion of Kuwait, the Iraqi nuclear program had set itself on a crash course to obtain enough fissile material in order to build a viable dirty bomb, but at this point they had not yet achieved it. However, they did manage to produce 1,200 bombs and 13,000 artillery shells and 8,000 rockets loaded with chemical weapons. They also had 166 bombs and 25 missiles with biological weapons, but Kemal doubted they would work based on their tests the previous spring. In a meeting with his generals, Saddam suggested that they use captured American soldiers as human shields, tying them to the front of their tanks, believing the Americans would never fire on their own men. One general spoke up. But instead of criticizing the tactic as inhumane, he simply said that their forces wouldn't be able to withstand the coming attack, and therefore it would be unlikely that they could capture enough US soldiers to use as human shields. Saddam responded to this general, saying, "Our forces will put up more of a fight than you think. They can dig bunkers and withstand America's aerial attacks. They will fight for a long time, and there will be many casualties on both sides. Only we are willing to accept casualties. The Americans are not. The American people are weak. They would not accept the losses of large numbers of their soldiers." On New Year's Eve, while at Camp David, President Bush had written a letter to his children, lamenting the mistakes of past leaders, the good men who did nothing while evil triumphed. My mind goes back to history. How many lives might have been saved if appeasement had given way to force earlier on in the late 30s or earliest 40s? How many Jews might have been spared the gas chambers, or how many Polish patriots might be alive today? I look at today's crisis as good versus evil. Yes, it is that clear. The January 15th deadline came and went. Saddam hadn't pulled out, but the coalition hadn't started the attack either. President Bush had decided to wait until the early AM hours of January 17th Gulf time to begin the airstrikes. F-117s and Apaches would take out Iraq's early warning system, while the president addressed the nation at 9 p.m.
Just 2 hours ago, Allied air forces began an attack on military targets in Iraq and Kuwait. These attacks continue as I speak. Ground forces are not engaged. This conflict started August 2nd when the dictator of Iraq invaded a small and helpless neighbor. Kuwait, a member of the Arab League and a member of the United Nations, was crushed. Its people brutalized. 5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
Journalists in the region began reporting attacks on targets in Iraq before they were officially announced, but most of the early reports were positive, and by 5 a.m. only one pilot had been lost. Early on in the fighting, the U.S. would capture a few Iraqi soldiers, from whom blood samples would be taken to see if they had been vaccinated against anthrax and other biological weapons, which could give a clue as to whether Saddam was planning to use WMDs. On top of the publicly stated objectives of expelling Iraqi forces from Kuwait and weakening the Iraqi military so it didn't have the power to threaten its neighbors afterwards, they had some unofficial goals as well. Most importantly, they wanted to oust Saddam from power, one way or another. The least direct way was to incite a revolt against Saddam, either from within the military, who feared the war would weaken their political position, or via popular rebellion against the economic deprivation of the war. Of course, this is the same logic behind sanctions, which have a spotty track record in inducing political change. Of course, many Iraqis were already miserable and cowed under Ba'ath Party rule. Despite their suffering, they had not risen up because Iraq's police state had made even passing talk of such rebellion mortally dangerous. The other means of removing Saddam from power was to kill him, but they couldn't do so directly. As mentioned earlier, Reagan had signed an executive order banning assassinations of foreign leaders. On the other hand, Saddam was also the highest-ranking member of the Iraqi armed forces, wore a military uniform, and bore a sidearm. So under the laws of war, he was seen as a legitimate target. Instead of sending in a team of Navy SEALs to raid one of his dozens of palaces, the coalition airstrikes were targeting places Saddam was known to frequent. In one instance, they used clues from a company that sold a brand of ATVs Saddam was known to prefer and targeted homes with this style ATV outside of them. We don't do assassinations, but yes, we targeted all the places where Saddam might have been. Saddam's strategy, however, was to drag the coalition into a prolonged ground war, with casualty counts too high for the Western democracies to politically sustain. He was betting on Vietnam Syndrome to win the war for him. Secretary Baker spent the first hours of the war rejecting virtually every peace proposal the Soviets made, knowing that most of them would be rejected by either President Bush or Saddam. But it wouldn't be too long before Saddam threw his Hail Mary.
I also want to say how outraged I am by Iraq's latest act of aggression, in this case against Israel. Once again, we see that no neighbor of Iraq is safe.
The morning after the first airstrike saw Saddam publicly blame Israel for inciting attacks on Iraq, and then accused Saudi Arabia of letting Israel station aircraft in its territory. Having limited their use of radio in order to prevent the coalition from intercepting their transmissions, Saddam would handwrite the orders sent to his Scud missile teams. Begin with Allah's blessing, striking targets inside the criminal Zionist entity with the heaviest fire possible. The firing must continue until further notice. At 3 a.m. on January 18, 1991, 7 Scud missiles hit Tel Aviv and Haifa, injuring 47 Israeli civilians. When news of this reached Washington, the administration debated whether they should condemn an Israeli retaliation, as Reagan had done in 1981, but Deputy Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger and Dan Quayle would convince him not to. In contrast to the president and Scowcroft, Secretary Cheney supported letting the Israelis retaliate against Saddam, under the assumption that if they couldn't stop them, then they should encourage them to get it over with quickly. There was also the rumor that some of these missiles were armed with chemical weapons, which would necessitate a strike from Israel. Of all the members in the cabinet, Cheney was the one most frequently in touch with the Israeli government via its defense minister, Moshe Arens. Just hours before Desert Storm began, Cheney informed them of when the airstrikes would begin and that a battery of Patriot missiles were on standby and ready to be delivered to Jerusalem upon request. Back in Israel, the cabinet was debating whether or not to retaliate, with a representative from Central Command attempting to dissuade them. The Scud missile launchers in western Iraq were on the list of targets for airstrikes, but Schwarzkopf had placed higher priority on hitting Iraqi assets around Baghdad and eastern Iraq. Cheney and Powell would both message Schwarzkopf to prioritize the missiles, not only to keep the Israelis out, but because the Iraqis were also firing them into Saudi Arabia as well, and based on some reports had even targeted Mecca and Medina. There were also reports of Scuds landing in Lebanon, Jordan, and the West Bank. Cheney, a big supporter of Israel, took his personal relationship with their leaders seriously. I'm the guy who gets to lean on the Israelis and who has to reassure them that we are doing everything we can. My credibility is crucial. If I tell them we are going to do something, then we will do it. In Jerusalem, Moshe Arens was telling the cabinet about his plan to drop special forces into western Iraq with jeeps in order to take out the mobile Scud launchers and escape across the Jordanian desert. The rest of the cabinet was skeptical about the efficacy, at which point the prime minister stopped the debate. Last night, President Bush called me. He said he had heard that Israel was planning on attacking in Iraq, and that it was unacceptable to him. If Israel attacked, the United States would not prevent the Saudi Air Force from shooting down Israeli aircraft that flew in its airspace. The whole coalition, which includes many Arab states, will collapse, and the blame will be on us. The decision had been made not to retaliate. Moshe Arens was told to call up Cheney and request the Patriot missile battery. The IDF inspected the Scud landing sites, and after an analysis, they found that there were no signs of any chemical or biological agents, meaning that Saddam had not used WMDs as many feared, which they quickly relayed to the Americans. The Iraqis had chemical weapons prepared to fire, but chose not to, fearing the Israelis would retaliate with nuclear weapons. Within a couple days, Patriots were sent from Germany to Israel, and although they failed to stop most of the Scud attacks, the Scuds failed to damage much of anything except Shamir's political career. I can think of nothing that went more against my grain as a Jew and a Zionist, nothing more opposed to the ideology on which my life has been based, to ask the people of Israel to accept the burden of restraint in the face of attack. Schwarzkopf would reallocate some of the priority airstrikes to western Iraq, and although the Israelis weren't allowed to participate directly, they would aid the coalition in taking out the mobile launchers. An Israeli commando team, disguised in British uniforms, were snuck into western Iraq and telephoned intelligence to Central Command on the locations of the Scuds. Although King Fahd had reassured President Bush that the Saudi troops would stay the course if the Iraqis dragged the Israelis into the fight, there were reasons for doubt. General Schwarzkopf's translator, Rick Francoa, gives an account of when the Situation Room in Riyadh heard about the Tel Aviv strikes, all of the Saudis cheered. On top of the Patriot missiles, Bush gave the okay for the Israelis to fire a missile at an airfield in northern Iraq, but Shamir declined. At this point, the Germans would provide actual military support by sending aircraft to Turkey as part of a NATO force, as well as sending an emissary to Jerusalem. While all of the Israel stuff was going on, Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to get Bush to halt the air campaign, claiming he was going to offer another peace proposal to Saddam, but the president rejected this because not only was Saddam perfectly capable of pulling his troops out of Kuwait during the airstrikes, but because Saddam's army would be preserved, which would allow him to claim a moral victory in the Arab world. I saw no evidence that Saddam was willing to comply with the UN resolutions, and besides, he could withdraw in a minute if he wanted. We did not need to offer him anything. I had in mind the bombing pauses that Johnson and Nixon were pressured into during the Vietnam War. Instead of bringing peace, they gave the enemy a chance to regroup. I was determined not to repeat the mistake. The new Soviet Foreign Minister, Alexander Besmertnik, would accuse the U.S. of expanding military operations beyond what the UN resolution authorized by targeting targets in Iraq. He would try to pressure Secretary Baker into signing a joint statement supporting a ceasefire, with an implied linkage to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which the administration also rejected. By the end of January, all 4 of Iraq's main nuclear research reactors had been destroyed, along with its biological weapons production capabilities severely damaged. Although the casualty counts were lopsided against the Iraqis, they did manage to capture several coalition pilots, who would be paraded through the streets and held captive at various sites to be used as human shields. Saddam also made sure to orchestrate propaganda events for the media. Prior to the war, most foreign media outlets had been expelled from Iraq, except for one, CNN. And what would usually happen is, after coalition airstrikes, Iraqi officials would take CNN journalists to these places and claim, oh, this was some civilian facility, a factory for baby formula, a homeless shelter, or something like that. When in reality, most of the time, it was revealed to have, in fact, been a critical part of Saddam's military and weapons systems. I was irritated by the argument that the media in general were only impartial observers, and that all this was only part of looking down at 2 warring parties. These were people covering a war in which, as Americans, they had a stake. I had an awful feeling that they were hoping to prove the Pentagon wrong on something. While I knew the correspondents were trying to do their jobs, I thought the American people saw the selective emphasis in much of their reporting as prejudicial to U.S. interests. I know I did. Saddam's plan of baiting the coalition into a premature ground strike and thus turning the conflict into Vietnam in the desert had failed. And by this point, he had reached his, if I can't have it, then nobody can moment. Because Saddam was still in this conspiracy-rattled mind thought that what the Western powers wanted was to control all of their oil, control the price of oil, and then control Kuwaiti oil so they could destroy Iraq. And so Saddam decided that he would deprive them of their hard-earned prize. On January 24th, the coalition began receiving reports that Iraqi forces were setting fire to oil stations in Kuwait, along with pumping crude oil into the Gulf. Saddam had also given orders to his subordinates to start executing POWs, but his commanders refused the orders. By February, the coalition hadn't decided on a date for a ground invasion yet, and at that point, many were wondering whether or not one was necessary after the intensive air campaign. Within the administration, it was merely a question of when to begin, with Powell and Scowcroft wanting to prolong the air campaign as much as possible, while Secretary Cheney wanting to push up the timeline. Scowcroft would tell Cheney that he would be ready no earlier than February 21st. The Soviets made another peace gambit in mid-February, with Yevgeny Primakov being sent to Baghdad. He meets with Saddam on February 11th, telling Saddam to announce his withdrawal from Kuwait, and to quickly follow that up with an actual evacuation. But Saddam was hesitant, wanting assurances that his troops wouldn't be shot at while leaving. He also demanded that sanctions be lifted and that there be some kind of regime change in Kuwait after he withdrew, but Primakov told him that none of these demands were on the table. I believe these attempts by Gorbachev to mediate were aimed primarily at salvaging some influence and bolstering his ever-weakening political strength at home. Our efforts to discourage him were more in sorrow than in anger, and we tried to say no as gently as possible without causing him difficulty. Initially, the Iraqi government announced that Saddam had accepted a peace proposal, but shortly after, he attached a bunch of conditions, including resolutions to the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. President Bush would reject these conditions, and in a press conference, he would publicly encourage the people of Iraq to overthrow Saddam. Another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands and force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside and then comply with the United Nations resolution. After another peace proposal was rejected, President Bush would give Saddam an ultimatum to unconditionally withdraw by February 23rd.
I have decided that the time has come to make public, with specificity, just exactly what is required of Iraq if a ground war is to be avoided. Most important, the coalition will give Saddam Hussein until noon Saturday to do what he must do. Begin his immediate and unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait. We must hear publicly and authoritatively his acceptance of these terms. The The statement to be released, as you will see, does just this and informs Saddam Hussein that he risks subjecting the Iraqi people to further hardship unless the Iraqi government complies fully with the terms of the statement. More importantly and more urgently, we learned this morning that Saddam has now launched a scorched earth policy against Kuwait, anticipating perhaps that he will now be forced to leave. He is wantonly setting fires to and destroying the oil wells, the oil tanks, the export terminals, and other installations of that small country. Indeed, they're destroying the entire oil production system of Kuwait.
In addition to this, the Iraqis would begin executing Kuwaiti prisoners en masse. The U.S. would announce additional conditions beyond what the UN resolution called for, such as the complete withdrawal of troops, stopping Scud attacks, no chemical weapons use, and immediate swap of POWs. Gorbachev tried to get a ceasefire for Saddam to withdraw, attempting to convince Bush to hold off for 4 days. But Saddam tried tying his withdrawal to other conditions too many times for an agreement to be trusted. Saddam is simply trying to save face and restore himself. He is taking advantage of the lull to destroy Kuwait. Get your intelligence people to show you photos of what the Iraqis are doing to the oil facilities. I can't let a deadline pass without action. Hard as you have tried, there are still deadlines.
Yesterday, after conferring with my senior national security advisors and following extensive consultations with our coalition partners, Saddam Hussein was given one last chance, set forth in very explicit terms to do what he should have done more than 6 months ago: withdraw from Kuwait without condition or further delay and comply fully with the resolutions passed by the United Nations Security Council. Regrettably, the noon deadline passed without the agreement of the government of Iraq to meet demands of United Nations Security Council Resolution 660, as set forth in the specific terms spelled out by the coalition to withdraw unconditionally from Kuwait. To the contrary, what we have seen is a redoubling of Saddam Hussein's efforts to destroy completely Kuwait and its people. I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf, in conjunction with coalition forces, to use all forces available, including ground forces, to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait.
On February 24th, 4 a.m. Saudi time, the ground invasion began. Saddam met with his commanders, where a message from Gorbachev was read aloud, warning Saddam not to set fire to the Kuwaiti oil fields for fear that this was motivating coalition forces. In private, Saddam would bemoan Moscow's betrayal for not preventing this calamity. There were 300,000 Iraqi soldiers occupying Kuwait, with the Republican Guards stationed in southern Iraq, while the coalition had over 700,000 soldiers. The coalition were able to move quickly, with thousands of Iraqi soldiers surrendering. By February 25th, Tariq Aziz was in Moscow trying to secure a ceasefire, while radio broadcasts in Baghdad were claiming that Iraqi forces were withdrawing from Kuwait. The administration debated what to do. The president and the Pentagon wanted Iraqi forces to drop their weapons before retreating. But Secretary Baker points out that the UN resolution didn't mandate the disarming of the Iraqi army. Powell suggests that they keep going since they hadn't received any official statement from Saddam. They came to the decision that they would not fire on unarmed retreating soldiers, justifying it by citing several incidents in previous weeks where Iraqi soldiers feinted a retreat after attacking coalition ground forces. They also said they would only accept an explicit statement from Saddam that Iraq would fully comply with the UN resolutions. Saddam had indeed decided to pull out of Kuwait, but in order to save face, he refused to publicly acknowledge that he was following UN resolutions. And on top of that, he decided to declare victory as his troops were evacuating. Applaud your victories, my dear citizens. You have faced 30 countries and the evil they have brought here. You have faced the whole world, great Iraqis. You have won. You are victorious. How sweet victory is. Furious at Saddam's attempted spin, the president said, "He is not withdrawing. His defeated forces are retreating. He is trying to claim victory in the midst of a rout." As planned, Arab coalition members were the first to enter Kuwait City, with the Bush administration wanting to make the defeat of Saddam as much of a pan-Arab victory as it was an American one. Coalition forces had advanced so quickly that the Republican Guard hadn't bothered to come and reinforce the regular army. Instead, most of the Iraqi army was busy retreating, using stolen civilian vehicles to carry as much material wealth out of the country as they could along the road between Kuwait City and Basra. But coalition aircraft targeted this convoy along with the regular army vehicles. The pilots would end up calling it a turkey shoot, while journalists and historians have dubbed it the Highway of Death. The last Iraqi soldier withdrew on February 27th. President Bush called General Scowcroft to ask if it was time to stop. Scowcroft informed him that all Iraqi forces were out of Kuwait, and thus the UN mandate was fulfilled. But there was hesitancy within the administration. They had wanted to militarily weaken Saddam to the point where he couldn't threaten his neighbors, but they also wanted to weaken the Republican Guard in order to weaken Saddam's regime, so that the military or a popular revolt could overthrow him. And some of the cabinet were even willing to chase down the Republican Guard all the way to Baghdad to do it themselves. But, with trepidation, President Bush decided to call an end to military operations after a clean 100 hours of combat.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. Kuwait is once more in the hands of Kuwaitis in control of their own destiny. We share in their joy, a joy tempered only by our compassion for their ordeal. Tonight, the Kuwaiti flag once again flies above the capital of a free and sovereign nation, and the American flag flies above our embassy. 7 months ago, America and the world drew a line in the sand. We declared that the aggression against Kuwait would not stand. And tonight, America and the world have kept their word. This is not a time of euphoria, certainly not a time to gloat, but it is a time of pride. Pride in our troops, pride in the friends who stood with us in the crisis, pride in our nation, and the people whose strength and resolve made victory quick, decisive, and just.
Still no feeling of euphoria. I think I know why it is. After my speech last night, Baghdad Radio started broadcasting that we've been forced to capitulate. It is such canard, so little, but it's what concerns me. It hasn't had a clean end. We have been told repeatedly by our own intelligence services and by our Arab allies that Saddam would never survive after the blow the coalition had delivered. But he was able to turn the fact that he had stood up to and survived a massive assault into a personal victory. However, some were optimistic about the outcome, believing it finally restored confidence in the U.S. military.
The loss of one human life is intolerable to any of us who are in the military. But I would tell you that casualties of that order of magnitude, considering the job that's been done and the number of forces that are involved, is almost miraculous as far as the light number of casualties. It'll never be miraculous to the families of those people, but it is miraculous.
The chart you showed there with the attrition rates of the various forces was almost the exact reverse of what most of us thought was happening. It showed the frontline troops attrited to 75% or more, and the Republican Guards, which a lot of public focus was on when we were covering the air war, attrited at less than 75. Why is that? I mean, how did it come to pass?
Put that chart up again, Roger, will you please? Let me tell you how we did this. We started off, of course, against the strategic targets, and I briefed you on that before. At the same time, we were hitting the Republican Guard. But the Republican Guard, you must remember, is a mechanized armor force for the most part that is very, very well dug in and very, very well spread out. So in initial stages of the game, we were hitting the Republican Guard heavily, but we were hitting them with strategic type bombers rather than pinpoint precision bombers. For lack of a better word, what happened is the air campaign shifted from the strategic phase into the theater, and we knew all along that this was the important area. The nightmare scenario for all of us would have been to go through, get hung up in this breach right here, and then have the enemy artillery rain chemical weapons down on troops that were in a gaggle in the breach right there. That was the nightmare scenario. So one of the things that we felt we must have established is an absolute as much destruction as we could possibly get of the artillery, the direct support artillery that would be firing on that wire. That's why we shifted it in the very latter days. We absolutely punished this area very heavily, because that was the first challenge. Once we got through this and we're moving, then it's a different war. Then we're fighting our kind of war. Before we get through that, we're fighting their kind of war, and that's what we didn't want to have to do. At the same time, we continued to attrit the Republican Guard, and that's why I would tell you that again, the figures that we're giving you are conservative. They always have been conservative, but we promised you at the outset we weren't going to give you anything inflated. We were going to give you the best we had. Yes, sir.
It seems that you've done so much that the job is effectively done. Can I ask you, what do you think really needs more to be done? Because his forces are, if not destroyed, certainly no longer capable of posing a threat to the region. They seem to want to go home. What more has to be done?
Put the last chart up, please. The last arrow, the large arrow. If I'm to accomplish the mission that I was given, and that's to make sure that the Republican Guard is rendered incapable of conducting the type of heinous act that they've conducted so often in the past, what has to be done is these forces continue to attack across here and put the Republican Guard out of business. We're not in the business of killing them. We have PSYOPs aircraft up. We're telling them over and over again, all you got to do is get out of your tanks and move off, and you will not be killed. But they're continuing to fight, and as long as they continue to fight, we're going to continue to fight with them.
That move on the extreme left, which got within 150 miles of Baghdad, was it also part of the plan that the Iraqis might have thought that it was going to Baghdad, and would that have contributed to the deception?
I wouldn't have minded at all if they'd gotten a little bit nervous about it. I really, and I mean that very sincerely. I would have been delighted if they'd gotten very, very nervous about it. Frankly, I don't think they ever knew it was there. I think they never knew it was there until the door had already been closed on. The one thing I would say to the press that I was delighted with is in the very, very early stages of this operation, when we were over here building up and we didn't have very much on the ground, you all were giving us a credit for a whole lot more over here. And as a result, that gave me quite a feeling of confidence that we might not be attacked quite as quickly as I thought we were going to be attacked.
General, you've said many times in the past that you do not like body counts. You've also told us tonight that the enemy casualties were very, very large. I'm wondering, with the coalition forces already burying the dead on the battlefield, will there ever be any sort of accounting or head counts made or anything like that?
I don't think there's ever in the history of warfare been a successful count of dead. And one of the reasons is for the reason you say, and that's because it's necessary to lay those people to rest for a lot of reasons, and that happens. So I would say that no, there will never be an exact count. You know, but probably in the days to come, you're going to hear many, many stories, either overinflated or underinflated, depending upon who you hear them from. The people who will know best, unfortunately, are the families that won't see their loved ones come home.
I came away feeling that America was reaching the point when it could put Vietnam behind it and again contemplate the massive and sustained use of force for the enforcement of just foreign policy objectives. President Bush had said that Saddam's aggression would not stand. He had delivered. Now, when he told the Congress that he would work to produce Arab-Israeli peace, no one in the Arab world seemed to doubt him. The coalition had lost 292 soldiers, with only 147 of them being combat deaths, along with fewer than 800 wounded. Between 20 and 50,000 Iraqi soldiers were killed, over 75,000 wounded, and nearly 200,000 captured. Over 1,000 Kuwaiti civilians had been killed, with over 600 pronounced missing. Over 3,000 Iraqi civilians would be killed. 75 people were killed in Israel and Saudi Arabia, along with 309 injured. The battle for Kuwait was over, but that was not the end of the story. Inspired by Saddam's newly perceived weakness, and the president's encouragement before the ground invasion, the Kurds of northern Iraq, trained and armed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, rose up against Baghdad. And down in southern Iraq, the Shiites also rose up against the Baathists. But the administration, not wanting to go beyond the UN mandate, decided not to aid them. Most of the officials would claim that their encouragement to overthrow Saddam wasn't aimed at the masses, but at the military. The sanctions levied on Iraq during the crisis wouldn't be lifted after their withdrawal from Kuwait. Because Saddam never admitted defeat or explicitly complied with the UN resolutions, many feared he would try it again. So the decision was made to keep the sanctions in place. This, of course, would result in the continued deprivation of the Iraqi people, while Saddam and his regime remained personally unfazed. The Kuwaiti government would be restored, but it would take years to rebuild the country, but not before they got their own revenge. The Palestinians in Iraq, the West Bank, and Gaza had all been openly supportive of Saddam and the invasion, and both Yasser Arafat and the PLO openly endorsed it. After the war, the Gulf states would expel hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their borders. Legally, they did this by simply not renewing the work visas that many Palestinians were using to live in these Gulf states, even though this was quite obviously an act of collective punishment. And from the Arab perspective, it was justified. In the Arab world, the PLO was recognized as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians, basically treating it as a proper state. And from their perspective, the PLO supported Saddam. And since the PLO was the de facto government of the Palestinians, you could deport them if the PLO showed hostilities toward you. That was the logic. And it wasn't just the Palestinians being deported from the Gulf states. The Saudis had also deported 800,000 Yemenis living in Saudi Arabia over their government's support for Saddam. The vindictiveness of the Gulf states was, of course, inspired by Saddam's own proven hostilities toward them. But there was another fuel to the fire: conspiracism. Just as Saddam's invasion of Kuwait came in part from a strong belief in a conspiracy theory to subvert it, the Gulf states were also motivated by conspiracies. A popular conspiracy theory alleged a plot to carve up Saudi Arabia, with Iraq annexing Kuwait and northern Saudi Arabia, Jordan annexing eastern Saudi Arabia, Yemen annexing the provinces of Asir and Rub al-Khalil, and eastern Saudi Arabia being given to the PLO. The evidence for any of this was, at best, threadbare and more often than not, provably false. But as it turns out, conspiracism is a major force in Arab politics, and not just amongst the popular masses, but amongst its leaders as well. There's so much more that could be said about the aftermath of the Gulf War and its long-term consequences, like the 2003 invasion of Iraq, but that is way too much to cover in just this video, and so that'll be a subject for another day. Thank you all so much for watching to the end of this long video, as well as for following through with this series. Thank you. If you are interested in supporting this channel, you can do so through all the usual means: Patreon, PayPal donation, Super Chat, or even get me a piece of research material from my Amazon wishlist full of books. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.